4. Fourth adventure. The mistake of the watchman in arresting Mr. George Pepusch for a thief was soon explained. In the meantime, however, some informalities had been discovered in his passport, and for this reason they required that he should produce some resident citizen of Frankfurt as his bail, till when he must be contented with his present place in prison. Here then sat Mr. George Pepusch in a very neat room, meditating on whom he could find in Frankfurt to be his bail. He had been away so long that he feared he must be forgotten by those who had formerly known him well, and, as to foreign recommendations, he possessed none whatever. He began to look out of the window in a very melancholy mood, and cursed his fate aloud, when a window was opened close by him, and a voice exclaimed, "What? Do I see right? Is it you, George?" Mr. Pepusch was not a little astonished on perceiving the friend, with whom he had been most intimate during his residence at Madras. "The deuce," he exclaimed, "that I should be so forgetful, so utterly stupid. I knew that you had got safely into harbour, and in Hamburg heard strange things of your way of living, and, when I had got here, never thought of paying you a visit. But he who has such wonderful things in his head as I have, well, it is lucky that accident brought you to me. You see I am under arrest, but you can immediately set me free, by answering for my being really the George Pepusch, whom you knew years ago, and not a thief nor a robber." "Why," replied Peregrine, "I should be an excellent bail, being myself under arrest." He now related at large to his friend, how since his return to Frankfurt he had found himself deprived of both his parents, and had from that time led, amidst all the bustle of a city, a lonely joyless life, devoted to the memory of other days. To this George replied morosely, "Oh yes, I have heard of it, I have heard of the fool's tricks you play, that you may waste life in a childish dream. You would be a hero of innocence, of childishness, and for this despise the just claims which society has upon you. You give imaginary family feasts, and bestow upon the poor the costly viands, the dear wines, which you have before served up to the dead. You give yourself Christmas boxes, and act as if you were a child, and then present to poor children these gifts, which are of the sort usually wasted in rich houses upon spoiled young ones. But you do not reflect that you are doing a scurvy benefit to the poor in tickling their gums with delicacies, that they may doubly feel their wretchedness, when afterwards they are compelled, by pressing hunger, to eat the vile bits that would be rejected by many a petted lapdog. Ha! How this alms-giving disgusts me, when I think that what you thus waste in a day would be sufficient to support them for months in a moderate manner. Then too you overload them with glittering gewgaws, when a common toy, presented by their fathers or mothers, gives them infinitely more pleasure. They eat themselves sick with your infernal marzipan, and with the knowledge of your splendid gifts, which in the end must be denied to them, you sow in their young minds the seeds of discontent and uneasiness. You are rich, full of youth, and yet withdraw yourself from all society, and thus frustrate the approaches of well-meaning minds. I will believe that the death of your parents may have shaken you, but if everyone who has suffered a real loss were to creep into his shell, by heavens, the whole world would be like a house of mourning, and I would not live in it. But, my friend, do you know that you are under the influence of the most determined egotism that ever lurked beneath a silly misanthropy? Go, go, Peregrine, I can no longer esteem you, no longer be your friend, if you do not change this way of life, and give up your abominable system of housekeeping." Peregrine snapped his fingers, and Master Flea instantly placed the microscopic glass in his eye. The thoughts of the angry Pepusch ran thus: "Is it not a pity that such a kind, understanding man should fall into these dangerous fancies, which at last will completely unnerve him, and deprive him of his best powers? But it is evident that his delicate mind, which is besides inclined to melancholy, could not endure the blow inflicted on him by the death of his parents, and he seeks for consolation in a mode of life which borders upon madness. He is lost if I do not save him. The more I esteem him, the harder I will attack him, and the stronger I will paint his folly." In these thoughts Peregrine saw that he had found his old friend unaltered, and, after Master Flea had taken the microscopic glass out of his eye, he said, "George, I will not contend with you as to what you say of my mode of life, for I know you mean it well with me, but I must tell you that it gives me real delight when I can make a day of festival to the poor, although in this I do not think of myself a detestable egotism, of which at least I feel unconscious. They are the flowers in my life, which else seems to me like a wild, melancholy field of thistles." "What do you say of thistles?" interrupted George Pepusch hastily. "Why do you despise thistles, and place them in opposition to flowers? Are you so little versed in natural history as not to know that the most wonderful blossom in the world is that of the thistle, I mean the Cactus grandiflorus? And again, is not the thistle, Zeherit, the most beautiful cactus under the sun? Peregrine, I have so long kept it from you, or rather was forced to keep it from you, because I myself had not the full conviction of it, but now learn that I myself am the thistle, Zeherit, and will never give up my claims to the hand of the daughter of the worthy king, Sekakis, the heavenly princess Gamaheh. I had found her, but in the same moment the diabolical watchman seized me, and dragged me to prison." "How," cried Peregrine, half petrified with astonishment, "are you too involved in the strangest of all histories?" "What history?" asked Pepusch. Peregrine did not hesitate to tell his friend, as he had before told Mr. Swammer, all that had happened at the bookbinder's, and afterwards at his own house. He did not even conceal the appearance of Master Flea, although, as may be easily supposed, he kept to himself the secret of his possessing the microscopic glass. George's eyes burnt, he bit his lips, struck his forehead, and, when Peregrine had ended, cried out like a maniac, "The false one! The traitress!" Greedy, in the self-pangs of despairing love, to drain the last drop from the poison cup, which Peregrine had unconsciously proffered him, he made him repeat every little trait of Dörtje's behavior, interrupting him with murmurs of, "in the arm," "on the breast," glowing kisses. Then again he started away from the window, and ran about the room with the gestures of a madman. In vain Peregrine cried out to him to hear the rest, exclaiming that he had much that was consolatory to say. Pepusch did not the more leave off his raving. The door was opened, and an officer of the council announced to Peregrine that no sufficient cause had been found for his longer imprisonment, and he might return home. The first use Peregrine made of his regained freedom was to offer himself as bail for George Pepusch, testifying that he was really George Pepusch, with whom he had lived in intimacy at Madras, and who was known to him for a man of fortune and respectability. Master Flea exhausted himself in very philosophic and instructive reflections, which amounted to this: that the thistle, Zeherit, in spite of his rough exterior, was very kind and reasonable, but a little too overbearing, and fairly considered was quite correct in his censure of Mr. Peregrine's way of life, though somewhat too harsh perhaps in his expressions. He too, that is, Master Flea, would really advise Mr. Peregrine henceforth to go abroad in the world. "Believe me," he said, "it will bring you many advantages to leave your solitude. You need no longer fear seeming shy and confused, as with the mysterious glass in your eye you command the thoughts of men, and it is therefore impossible that you should not always maintain the right tact. How firmly and calmly may you stand before the highest, while their inward souls lie open to your eyes. Therefore, move freely in the world, your blood will circulate more lightly, all melancholy brooding will cease and, which is the best of all, motley ideas and thoughts will arise in your brain, the image of the fair Gamaheh will lose its brightness, and you will soon be better able to keep your word with me." Peregrine felt that both George Pepusch and Master Flea meant him well, and he resolved to follow their wise advice. But when he heard the sweet voice of his beautiful beloved, he could not think how it was possible for him to leave the house, which had become a paradise to him. At length he brought himself to visit a public promenade. Master Flea had fixed the glass in his eye, and taken up a place in his collar, where he gently rocked himself to and fro at his ease. "Have I at last the pleasure of seeing my good friend Mr. Tyss again? You make yourself scarce, my dear sir, and we have all been longing for you. Let us go into a coffee house, and take a glass of wine together. I am truly rejoiced to see you." It was thus that he was addressed by a young man, whom he had seen scarcely 2 or 3 times. The thoughts ran thus: "Is the stupid misanthrope visible again? But I must flatter him, that I may soon borrow money of him. He'll not surely be possessed by the devil, and accept my invitation. I have not a halfpenny in my pocket, and no innkeeper will trust me any longer." Two well-dressed girls now crossed him. They were sisters, distantly related to him. "Ah, cousin," cried one of them, laughing, "do we meet you at last? It is not well done to lock yourself up so that one can never get a sight of you. You do not know how fond Mamma is of you, because you are such a sensible man. Promise me to come soon. There, kiss my hand." The thoughts ran thus: how? What is this? What has come to our cousin? I wanted to make him blush and stammer, and formerly he used to run away from every girl, but now he stands and eyes me so strangely, and kisses my hand without the least shyness. If he should be in love with me, that would be a fine thing. My mother says that he is somewhat stupid, but what does that signify? I will have him. A stupid man, when he is rich as my cousin is the very best. The sister had merely lisped, with downcast eyes and blushing cheeks, "Come to us shortly, dear cousin." The thoughts ran thus: our cousin is a very handsome man, and I do not understand why Mamma calls him silly, and can't endure him. If he should come to our house, he will fall in love with me, for I am the prettiest girl in all Frankfurt. I will have him, because I want a rich man, that I may sleep till 12 o'clock in the day, and wear dearer shawls than my sister. A physician, in passing, perceived Peregrine, stopped his carriage, and called out, "Good morning, my dear sir. You look uncommonly well, heaven keep you so. But, if anything should happen, think of me, the old friend of your late father. Such sound constitutions as yours I can soon set to rights. Adieu." The thoughts ran thus: I believe the fellow is constantly well out of pure avarice, but he looks tolerably pale now, and seems at last to have something the matter with him. Well, only let him once come under my hands, and he shall not soon get up from his bed again. He shall undergo a sound penance for his obstinate health. Immediately after this, an old merchant cried out to him, "My best greetings to you, worthy Mr. Tyss. See how I am forced to run and bustle, and plague myself with business. You have done wisely in withdrawing from it, though with your quick-sightedness you could not fail of doubling your father's fortune." The thoughts were thus: if the fool would only meddle with business, he would speculate away his whole fortune in a short time, and that would be a real delight. His old papa, whose joy was in ruining other people that wished to help themselves by a little bankruptcy, would turn himself about in his grave. Many more such cutting contrasts between words and thoughts occurred to Peregrine. He always directed his answers rather by what people meant than by what they said, and, as he penetrated into their inmost intents, they themselves were puzzled what to think of him. At last he felt wearied, snapped his fingers, and immediately the glass vanished from the pupil of his left eye. On returning to his house he was surprised by a strange spectacle. A man stood in the middle of the passage, looking steadfastly through a strangely formed glass at Mr. Swammer's door. Upon this door sunbright circles played in rainbow colors, and then met in one fiery point that seemed to pierce through the wood. As this took place a deep sighing was heard, broken by cries of pain, which came, as it appeared, from the room. To his horror, Peregrine fancied that he distinguished Gamaheh's voice. "What do you want? What are you doing here?" he exclaimed to the man, who really seemed to be practicing diabolic arts, the rainbow circles growing with every moment quicker and brighter, the center point piercing more keenly, and the cries sounding more painfully from the chamber. "Oh!" exclaimed the stranger, closing his glass, and hastily putting it into his pocket. "Oh, the landlord. Your pardon, my dear sir, that I am operating here without your permission. I did indeed pay you a visit to request it, but Alina told me you had gone out, and the business here would admit of no delay." "What business?" said Peregrine, pretty harshly. "What business is it that will admit of no delay?" "Don't you know," replied the stranger with an odious grin, "don't you know that my ill-advised niece, Dörtje Elverdink, has run away? You were arrested, though with great injustice, as her seducer, on which score I will with great pleasure testify your perfect innocence, if it should be requisite. It is not to you, but to Swammerdam, once my friend, and now my enemy, that the faithless Dörtje has fled. She is in that chamber, I know it, and alone, since Swammerdam has gone out. I cannot get in, as the door is barred and bolted, and I am too mild to employ force, but I have taken the liberty to torment her a little with my optical glass, that she may know I am her lord and master in spite of her imaginary princesship." "You are the devil," exclaimed Peregrine, in the highest indignation, "you are the devil, but not lord and master of the beautiful Gamaheh. Out of my house. Practice your devil's tricks where you will, but here you will fail with them, I can promise you." "Don't put yourself in a passion," replied Leuwenhoek, "don't put yourself in a passion, my dear Mr. Tyss. I am an innocent man, who means nothing but good. It is a little monster, a little basilisk, that sits in yonder room, in the shape of a lovely woman. If the abode with my insignificance displeased her, she might have fled, but the traitress should not have robbed me of my most precious treasure, the best friend of my soul, without whom I am nothing. She should not have run away with Master Flea. You will not understand what I mean, worthy sir, but—" Here Master Flea, who had planted himself in a secure place, could not refrain from bursting out into a fine mocking laugh. "Ha!" cried Leuwenhoek, struck with a sudden terror, "ha! What was that? Can it be possible? Here, on this spot? Permit me, my dear sir." Thus saying, Leuwenhoek stretched out his hand, and snatched at Peregrine's collar, who dexterously avoided his grasp, and, seizing him with a strong arm, dragged him towards the door, to fling him out without farther ado. But just as he had reached the door, it was opened from without, and in rushed George Pepusch, followed by Swammerdam. No sooner did Leuwenhoek perceive his enemy Swammerdam, than he burst from Peregrine with the utmost exertion of his last strength, and planted himself with his back against the door of the mysterious chamber, where the fair one was imprisoned. Swammerdam, seeing this, took a little telescope from his pocket, drew it out at full length, and fell upon his adversary, exclaiming, "Draw, scoundrel, if you have courage." Leuwenhoek had quickly a similar instrument in his hand, drew it out as the other had done, and cried, "Come on, I am ready, and you shall soon feel my prowess." Each now put his glass to his eye, and fell furiously upon the other with sharp, murderous glances, now lengthening and now shortening his weapon by drawing the tubes in and out. There were feints, parries, thrusts, in short, all the tricks of the fencing school, and with every moment they seemed to grow more angry. Whenever one was hit he cried out aloud, sprang into the air, cut the most wonderful capers, made the most beautiful entrechats, and turned pirouettes, as well as the best pas seul dancer on the Parisian stage, till his adversary fixed him fast with the shortened telescope. When the other was hit he did precisely the same, and in this way they went on interchangeably with the most violent springs, the maddest gestures, and the most furious cries. The perspiration dropped from their brows, the blood-red eyes seemed starting from their heads, and as there appeared no other cause for their st vitus dance than their looking at each other through their glasses, they might have been taken for maniacs, just escaped from the madhouse. For the rest, it was a very pretty sight. Swammerdam at last succeeded in driving Leuwenhoek from his post by the door which he had maintained with obstinate bravery, and thus carrying on the war in the remoter parts of the ground. George Pepusch saw the opportunity, pressed against the unoccupied door, that was neither barred nor bolted, and slipped into the chamber, but in the next moment he rushed out, exclaiming, "She has fled." Fled, and then hurried out of the house with the rapidity of lightning. Both Leuwenhoek and Swammerdam were seriously wounded, for both hopped and danced about after a mad fashion, and with their howlings and cryings made a music to it that seemed like the shrieks of the damned in hell. Peregrine knew not how to set about separating them, and thus ending a contest, which was as ludicrous as it was terrific. At last the combatants perceived that the door stood wide open, forgot their duel and their pains, put their destructive weapons into their pockets, and rushed into the chamber. Mr. Tyss took it grievously to heart that the fair one had fled from his house, and wished the abominable Leuwenhoek at the devil, when the voice of Alina was heard upon the stairs. She was laughing aloud, and muttered between, "What strange things one does see! Wonderful! Incredible!" "What?" cried Peregrine dejectedly, "what wonder has happened now?" "Oh, my dear Mr. Tyss," exclaimed the old woman, "only come upstairs directly, and go into your chamber." And she opened the room door with a cunning titter. On entering, oh wonder, oh joy! The little Dörtje Elverdink tripped up to him, in her dress of tissue, as he had before seen her at Mr. Swammer's. "At length I see you again," lisped the little one, and contrived to nestle up so closely to Peregrine that he could not help embracing her most tenderly in spite of all his good resolutions. His senses seemed ecstasied by love and joy. It has often happened to a man that in the height of his transports he has hit his nose somewhat roughly, and, being suddenly awakened out of his heaven by the earthly pain, has tumbled down again into the vulgar world. Just so it chanced with our Mr. Tyss. In stooping down to kiss Dörtje's sweet mouth, he gave his nose, of goodly dimensions, a hard blow against the diadem of shining brilliance, which the little one wore in her raven locks. The pain of the blow upon the sharp points of the stone brought him sufficiently to himself to perceive the diadem. The diadem reminded him of the Princess Gamaheh, and with this recollection recurred all that Master Flea had told him of the little siren. He bethought himself that a princess, the daughter of a mighty king, could not possibly care about his love, and therefore all her pretended affection must be a mere trick, by which the dissembler hoped to regain possession of Master Flea. With this consideration a cold ice stream seemed to rush through his veins, which, if it did not quite extinguish, at least damped, the love flames. Peregrine gently freed himself from the arms of the little one, who had lovingly embraced him, and said with downcast eyes, "Oh, heavens! You are the daughter of the mighty King Sekakis, the beautiful Gamaheh. Your pardon, princess, if a feeling, which I could not master, hurried me into folly, into madness. But yourself, lady—" "What are you saying, my fair friend?" interrupted Dörtje Elverdink. "I the daughter of a mighty king? I a princess? I am your Alina, who will love you to distraction, if you— But how is this? Alina, the queen of Golconda? She is already with you. I have spoken with her, a good kind woman, but she has grown old, and is no longer so handsome as in the time of her marriage with the French general. Woe is me! I am not the right one. I never ruled in Golconda. Woe is me!" The little one had closed her eyes, and began to totter. Peregrine conveyed her to a sofa. "Gamaheh," she went on, speaking in a state of somnambulism. "Gamaheh, do you say? Gamaheh, the daughter of King Sekakis? Yes, I recollect, in Famagusta. I was indeed a beautiful tulip, yet no, even then I felt desire and love in my breast. Still on that point." She was silent, and seemed to be falling into a perfect slumber. Peregrine undertook the perilous enterprise of placing her in a more convenient position, but, as he gently embraced her, a concealed pin prickled him sharply in the finger. According to his custom he snapped his fingers, and Master Flea, taking it for the concerted signal, immediately placed the microscopic glass in his eye. Now, as usual, Peregrine saw behind the tunicle of the eyes the strange interweaving of nerves and veins, which pierced deep into the brain. But with these were twined bright silver threads, 100 times thinner than the thinnest spider's web, and it was these very threads that confused him, for they seemed to be endless, branching out into something indistinguishable even by the microscopic eye. Perhaps they were thoughts of a sublimer kind, the others of a sort more easily comprehended. Then he observed flowers, strangely blended, which took the shape of men, then again men, who dissolved as it were into the earth, and peeped forth again as stones and metals. Amongst these all manner of beasts were in motion, who underwent innumerable changes, and spoke strange languages. No one appearance answered to the other, and in the plaintive sounds of sorrow that filled the air, there was a dissonance, corresponding with that of the images. But it was this very dissonance that ennobled still more the deep fundamental harmony, which broke out triumphantly, and united all that seemed irreconcilable. "Do not puzzle yourself," whispered Master Flea, "do not puzzle yourself, my good Peregrine. Those which you see are the images of a dream. Even if anything more should lurk behind them, Now is not the time for farther inquiry. Only call the little deceiver by her real name, and then sift her as much as you please. As the lady had many names, it must have been difficult, one would have thought, for Peregrine to hit upon the right, but, without the least reflection, he exclaimed, "Dörtje Elverdink. Dear, charming girl, was it no deceit? Is it possible that you can love me?" Immediately the little one awoke from her dreamy state, opened her eye, and said with burning glance, "What a doubt, my Peregrine, could a maiden do as I have done, unless her breast were filled with the most glowing passion? Peregrine, I love you more than anyone, and, if you will be mine, I am yours with my whole soul, and remain with you because I cannot leave you, and not merely to escape from the tyranny of my uncle." The silver threads had disappeared, and the thoughts, properly arranged, ran thus: "How is this? At first I feigned a passion for him only to regain Master Flea for myself and Leeuwenhoek, and now I actually am fond of him. I have caught myself in my own snares. I think no more of Master Flea, and would like to be his, who seems lovelier to me than any man I have ever seen." It may be easily supposed what effect these thoughts produced in Peregrine's breast. He fell on his knees before the fair one, covered her hand with 1,000 burning kisses, called her his joy, his heaven, his whole happiness. "Well," lisped the maiden, drawing him gently to her side, "well, my love, you certainly will not deny a request, on the fulfillment of which depends the repose, nay, the very existence of your beloved." "Demand," replied Peregrine, tenderly embracing her, "demand anything, my life, anything you will. Your slightest wish is my command. Nothing in the world is so dear to me that I would not with pleasure sacrifice it to you and your affection." "Woe is me," lisped Master Flea, who could have imagined that the little traitress would have conquered. "I am lost." "Here then," replied Gamaheh, after having returned with equal fire the glowing kisses, which Peregrine imprinted on her lips, "here then, I know how The door burst open, and in rushed George Pepusch. "Zeherit!" cried the little one in despair, and fell back on the sofa, senseless. The thistle, Zeherit, flew to the princess, took her in his arms, and ran off with the speed of lightning. For this time Master Flea was saved. The Fifth Adventure. With the speed of lightning, as the reader has already learned at the conclusion of the fourth adventure, George Pepusch snatched the fair one from the arms of the enamoured Peregrine, and left him behind petrified with astonishment and terror. When at length the latter came to his recollection, and would have followed his robber friend, all was still and desolate in the house. Upon his repeated calling, the old Alina came pattering up the stairs from one of the farthest rooms, and declared that she had not observed the slightest part of the whole business. Peregrine was nigh going mad at the loss of Dörtje, but Master Flea began to console him in a tone that must have inspired the most desperate with confidence. "You are not yet quite certain, my dear Mr. Peregrine, whether the fair Dörtje Elverdink has really left your house. As well as I can judge of such things, she is not far off. I seem to feel her nearness. But, if you will follow my friendly counsel, you will leave her to her fate. Trust me, she is as capricious as the wind. It may be, as you have said, that she now is really fond of you, but how long will it be before she plunges you into such misery, that you will be in danger from it of losing your reason, like the thistle, Zeherit? I say again, give up your lonely way of life. You will be the better for it. How many women have you known, that you should take Dörtje for the handsomest of her sex? What maiden have you approached with love, that you should believe that Dörtje alone can love you? Go to, Peregrine, experience will show you better. You are a well-made, handsome man, and I should not be so keen-sighted, as Master Flea really is, if I could not see beforehand that love would smile upon you in a very different way from what you may expect." Peregrine had already broken the ice by going abroad in public places, and it was therefore the less difficult for him to visit societies, from which he had formerly withdrawn himself. In this Master Flea rendered him excellent service with his microscopic glass, and he is said during this time to have kept a daybook, and to have made notes of the most remarkable and pleasant contradictions between words and thoughts, as they daily occurred to him. Perhaps the editor of this strange tale, called Master Flea, may find some future opportunity of bringing to light many worthy impartments from this same daybook. Here it would only stop the current of the history, and, therefore, would not be welcome to the reader. So much, however, may be said, that many of the phrases with the corresponding thoughts seem to be stereotyped as it were, as for example, "Favor me with your advice," the thought being, "He is fool enough to think I ask his advice in a matter that I have long since resolved upon, and that tickles him. I have the most perfect confidence in you," the thought being, "I knew long ago that you were a scoundrel," etc. It should also be mentioned that many folks mightily puzzled Peregrine with his microscopic observations. These were the young men, who fell into raptures upon everything, and poured themselves forth in a torrent of splendid phrases. Amongst these the most remarkable were the young poets, who were boiling over with imagination and genius, and were particularly adored by the ladies. To these were associated the bluestockings, who were as familiar with metaphysics as the less learned part of their sex with scandal, and could talk like any parson in his pulpit. If it seemed strange to Peregrine that the silver threads should twine together out of Gamaheh's brain into an undistinguishable something, he was not a little astonished at what he saw in the heads of those above mentioned. He saw indeed the strange weaving of nerves and veins, but remarked at the same time, that when the owners of them spoke most learnedly on art and science, they did not penetrate the brain, but were reflected outwards, so that all recognition of the thoughts was out of the question. He imparted his observation to Master Flea, who usually sat in a fold of his neckcloth, and Master Flea was of the opinion that what Peregrine took for thoughts were in reality none, but merely words, which in vain endeavoured to become thoughts. If Mr. Tyss began now to amuse himself in society, his faithful companion also laid aside much of his gravity, and exhibited himself as a knavish little voluptuary, an amiable roué. He could not see the fair neck or the white bosom of any beauty, without slipping out of his hiding place with the first opportunity, and springing on the inviting spot, where he very dexterously contrived to elude the attacks of pursuing fingers. This maneuver combined a double interest. In the first place, he found a pleasure in it for the thing itself, and then, he hoped, by drawing Peregrine's attention to the fair ones, to cast Dörtje's image into shadow. This however seemed to be a fruitless labour, for none of all the ladies, whom he now approached without the least timidity, seemed to him so fair and lovely as his little princess. The great cause however of his continued constancy was that in none he found the words and thoughts so united in his favour as with her. He was convinced that he could never leave her, and this he repeated incessantly. Master Flea was in no little alarm. One day Peregrine remarked that the old Alina laughed very cunningly, took snuff more frequently than usual, muttered strangely, in short, acted altogether like one who is big with a secret and would fain be disburdened of it. To everything she replied, "Yes, one can't tell that. One must wait," whether these words were suited to the occasion or not, till at last Peregrine, full of impatience, exclaimed, "Speak it out at once. Tell me what is the matter, without creeping around me with those mysterious looks." "Ah," cried the old woman, clasping her withered hands together, "ah, the dear little thing, the sweet little puppet." "Whom do you mean?" asked Peregrine angrily. "Ah," said the old woman, smirking. "Ah, whom should I mean but our princess, below here with Mr. Swammer, your bride, Mr. Tyss." "Woman," cried Mr. Tyss, "unlucky woman, she is here, in the house. And you do not tell me till now?" "Where," replied the old woman, without in the least losing her composure, "where should the princess be but here, where she has found her mother?" "How," cried Peregrine, "what is it you say, Alina?" "Yes," rejoined the old woman, drawing herself up. "Yes, Alina is my right name, and who knows what else may come to light, in a short time, before your nuptials." Peregrine entreated her, by all the angels and devils, to go on, but, without paying the least attention to his hurry, she seated herself snugly in the armchair, drew out her snuff-box, took a prodigious pinch, and demonstrated to Peregrine very circumstantially that there was no worse failing than impatience. "Calmness, my son, calmness is above all things requisite, or otherwise you run the risk of losing all in the moment that you think you have gained it. Before you get a word out of me, you must first promise to seat yourself there, quite quietly like a pretty behaved child, and for the life of you not to interrupt me in my story." Nothing was left to Peregrine but to obey the old woman, who, when he had seated himself, related things that were strange enough to hear. According to the old woman's tale, the two gentlemen, namely, Swammerdam and Leeuwenhoek, had another tough struggle in the chamber, and for a time kept up a terrible clatter. Then again all had become quite still, when a heavy moaning had made her fancy that one of the two was mortally wounded, but on peeping through the keyhole she perceived something quite different from what she had expected. Swammerdam and Leeuwenhoek had seized George Pepusch, and stroked and squeezed him with their fists, so that he grew thinner and thinner, during which operation he had uttered the moans heard by the old woman. At last, when he had grown as thin as a thistle stem, they had tried to squeeze him through the keyhole, and the poor Pepusch was hanging with half his body out, when she ran away in terror. Soon afterwards she heard a loud laughing, and saw Pepusch in his natural form, quietly led out of the house by the two magicians, while at the room door stood Dörtje and beckoned her in. The little one wished to dress herself, and needed her assistance. The old woman could not talk enough of the great heap of clothes which the princess brought out of a variety of chests and showed to her, each of which had appeared richer than the other. She declared that none but an Indian princess could possess such jewels as the little one. Her eyes still ached with the glitter. She then went on to say how, during the dressing, she had talked of this and that, of the late Mr. Tyss, on the delightful life they had formerly led in the house, and at last the conversation had fallen upon her deceased relations. "You know, my dear Mr. Tyss, that nothing is more valued by me than my late cousin, the calico printer's wife. She was in Mainz, and, I believe, even in the Indies, and could speak French and sing. If I owe to my cousin the unchristian name of Alina, I will forgive her that in the grave, since it is from her alone that I have learned polite manners and the art of speaking elegantly. As I was talking much of my cousin, the little princess asked after my father, my grandfather, and so on, higher and higher up the family. I opened my heart to her, told her that my mother had been almost as handsome as myself, except that I go beyond her in regard to the nose, which I derive from my father, and which is after the shape that has been usual in the family since the memory of man. Then I came to speak of the country wake, when I waltzed with Sergeant Drumstick, and wore the sky-blue stockings with red clocks. Ah, dear God! We are all weak, sinful creatures. But oh, Mr. Tyss, you should have seen how the little princess, who at first had laughed and tittered, that it was a pleasure to hear her, now grew more and more quiet, and gazed on me with such odd looks, that I began to be terribly alarmed. And then think, Mr. Tyss, on a sudden, before I could prevent it, she lies on her knees before me, and will positively kiss my hand, exclaiming, "Yes, it is you. Now I recognize you. It is yourself," and when, quite astonished, I asked what it all meant. Here the old woman stopped, and, when Peregrine pressed her to go on, she with great gravity and precision took a mighty pinch of snuff, and said, "You'll know in good time, my son, what farther happened. Everything has its time and hour." He was now more urgent than ever with the old woman to proceed, when she burst out into a roaring fit of laughter, upon which he admonished her, with a very sour face, that his room was not exactly the place for her to play off such fooleries. But the old woman, planting her hands in her sides, seemed ready to burst. The burning red of her brow changed to an agreeable mahogany, and Peregrine was upon the point of flinging a glass of water into the old woman's face, when she recovered her breath and speech at the same time. "I can't help laughing," she said. "I can't help laughing at the foolish little thing. No, such love is no longer on earth. Only think, Mr. Tyss." Here she broke out into a fresh fit of laughter, and Peregrine's patience was well nigh exhausted. At last, with much difficulty, he got out of her that the little princess had taken up the whimsical notion of Mr. Tyss being positively determined to marry the old woman, and had compelled her solemnly to promise to reject his hand. It seemed to Peregrine as if he were mixed up in a scene of witchery, and he felt so strangely, that even the honest old Alina appeared to him a supernatural kind of being, from whom he could not fly with sufficient speed. But she still detained him, having something to communicate in all haste, that concerned the little princess. "It is now certain," she said confidentially, "it is now certain, my dear Mr. Tyss, that the bright star of fortune has arisen, but it is your business to keep it favorable. When I protested to the little one that you were desperately smitten with her, and far from any idea of marrying me, she replied, that she could not be convinced of it and give you her hand till you had complied with a wish that had long sat near her heart. She says that she had a pretty little Negro boy in her service who had fled from her. I have indeed denied it, but she maintains that the boy is so little he might live in a nutshell." "Nothing will ever come of this," exclaimed Peregrine violently, well knowing what the old woman was driving at, and rushed out of the room, and then out of the house, with great vehemence. It is an established custom, that when the hero of a tale is under any violent agitation, he should run out into a forest, or at least, into some lonely wood, and the custom is good, because it really prevails in life. Hence it could not be otherwise with Mr. Tyss, than that he ran from his house without stopping, till he had left the city behind him and reached a remote wood. Moreover, as in a romantic history no wood must be without rustling leaves, sighing breezes, murmuring brooks, etc., etc., it is to be supposed that Peregrine found all these things in his place of refuge. Upon a mossy stone, the lower half of which lay in a bright brook, Peregrine sat down with a firm resolution to reflect on his strange adventures, and, if possible, find the Ariadne clue which might show the way out of this labyrinth of mysteries. The murmurs of the leaves, returning at equal intervals, the monotonous babbling of the waters, the constant clap of a distant mill, soon formed a ground which regulated the thoughts so that they no longer rushed wildly together without time or rhythms, but became an intelligible melody. Thus, after sitting some time on this pleasant spot, he got to reflect calmly. In reality, he said to himself, a fantastic tale writer could not have invented wilder events than I have actually gone through in the short space of a few days. Beauty, love itself visits the lonely misogynist, and a look, a word, is sufficient to fan, in his breast, the flames which he had dreaded without knowing them. But the time, the place, the whole appearance of the strange siren are so mysterious, that it seems to be the result of magic. And then it is not long before a despised little insect evinces knowledge, understanding, nay, even a sort of supernatural power. And this creature talks of things which to common minds are incomprehensible, in a way as if it all were nothing more than the familiar today and yesterday of usual life, as it appears repeated for the 1000th time. Have I come too near the flywheel, that dark unknown powers are driving, and has it caught me in its whirlings? Would not one believe, that the reason must be lost with such things, when they cross the path of life? And yet I find myself quite well, withal, nay, it no longer seems strange to me that a flea king should have sought my protection, and in requital have entrusted me with a mystery that opens to me the secrets of thought, and thus sets me above the deceptions of life. But whither will or can all this lead? How, if under this singular mask of a flea, an evil demon lurked, who sought to lure me into destruction, who aimed to rob me of all the happiness that might bloom to me in the possession of Dörtje? Were it not better to get rid at once of the little monster? That was a very pitiful idea, Mr. Tyss, exclaimed Master Flea, interrupting Peregrine's soliloquy. Do you imagine that the mystery I have entrusted to you is a trifle? Should not this gift pass for the most decided proof of my sincere friendship? Shame on you for being suspicious. You are surprised at the reason, the mind, of a little despised insect, and that proves, don't be offended, the narrowness of your education in science. I wish, in regard to the thinking instinctive soul of animals, you had read the Greek Philo, or, at least, the treatise of Hieronymus Rorarius, Quod Animalia Bruta Ration Utanta Melius Homin, or his oration Pro Muribus. Or that you knew what Lipsius and the great Leibniz thought of the mental power of beasts, or that you were aware what the profound Rabbi Maimonides has said about their souls, you would not then take me for a demon on account of my understanding, or measure the spiritual faculties by the proportions of the body. I suppose, at last, you will come to the shrewd opinion of the Spanish physician, Gomez Pereira, who could find nothing more in animals than mere artificial machines, without thought or freedom of will, moving arbitrarily and automatically. Yet, no, I cannot deem you so absurd, and am convinced that you have long ago learned better through my humble person. Moreover, I do not well understand what you call wonders, or in what way you are able to divide into the wonderful and natural, the appearances of our being, which in reality are ourselves, as we and they mutually condition each other. Do not, therefore, wonder at anything because it has not yet occurred to you, or because you fancy you do not see the connection of cause and effect, that only proves the natural or diseased obtuseness of your sight, which injures your perception. But do not take it amiss, Mr. Peregrine, the drollest part of the business is that you want to split yourself into two parts, one of which recognizes and willingly believes the so-called wonders, the other, on the contrary, is mightily astonished at this recognition and belief. Has it ever occurred to you that you believe in the images of dreams? I, exclaimed Peregrine, my dear fellow, how can you talk of dreams, which are only the result of some disorder in our corporeal or intellectual structure? At these words Master Flea burst into a laugh, as fine as it was mocking, and then said to Mr. Tyss, who was not a little confounded, My poor friend, is your understanding so little enlightened, that you do not see the folly of such opinions? Since the time that chaos melted together into plastic matter, it may be a tolerably long time ago, the spirit of the universe has formed all shapes out of this existing material, and from this come also dreams and their images. These images are sketches of what has been, or probably of what is yet to be, which the soul rapidly puts together for its amusement when the tyrant, called body, has released it from its slavish servitude. But here is neither time nor place to refute you, and bring you to a better conviction. Perhaps, too, it would be of no use whatever to you. One thing only I should like to explain. Dear master, cried Peregrine, speak, or be silent, as you think proper. Do what to you seems best, for I plainly perceive that however small you may be, you have deep knowledge and sound understanding. You compel from me unconditional confidence, although I do not quite comprehend your figurative modes of speech. Learn then, resumed Master Flea, that you are very strangely implicated in the history of the Princess Gamaheh. Swammerdam and Leuwenhoek, the Thistle, Zeherit, and the Leech Prince, as well as the Genius, the Tell, are all striving after the princess, and even I myself must confess that, alas, my old passion is reviving, and I could be fool enough to share my sovereignty with the false fair one. But you, Mr. Peregrine, are the principal person, and without your consent, Gamaheh can belong to no one. If you wish to understand the more particular connection of the whole, which I myself do not know, you must speak to Leuwenhoek about it. He has found it out, and will certainly let out much, if you will take the pains, and know how to question him. Master Flea was about to continue, when a man leapt from the bushes in boiling passion, and flew upon Peregrine. Ha! cried George Pepusch, with frantic gestures, for it was he. Ha! Faithless, treacherous friend! Have I found you? Found you in the fateful hour? Up then, pierce this breast, or fall by my hand. With this he drew a brace of pistols from his pocket, pressed one into Peregrine's hand, and took his ground with the other, crying, Shoot, coward, shoot. Peregrine placed himself, but declared that nothing should induce him to the incurable madness of entering into a duel with his only friend, without even a suspicion of the cause. At all events, he would in no case be the first to begin a murderous attack. At this Pepusch burst into a wild laugh, and in the same moment the ball went through Peregrine's hat. The latter remained staring at his friend in profound silence, without picking up the hat, which had fallen to the ground, when Pepusch advanced a few steps towards him, and murmured in a hollow voice, "Shoot." Peregrine fired his pistol in the air. With the voice and gestures of a madman, Pepusch now flung himself upon his friend's breast, and cried out, in heartrending tones, "She is dying. Dying for you, unlucky one. Quick! Save her. You can do it, save her for yourself, and let me perish in my despair." Pepusch ran off so fast that Peregrine had lost sight of him on the instant, and now a fearful foreboding came over him, that his friend's mad behavior must have been occasioned by something terrible which had happened to the little one, whereupon he hastened back to the city. On entering his house, he was met by the old woman, loudly lamenting that the poor princess was on the sudden taken violently ill, and was dying. Mr. Swammer himself had gone after the most celebrated physician in Frankfurt. With the feelings of death at his heart, he crept into Mr. Swammer's room that was opened to him by the old woman. There lay the little one upon a sofa, pale and stiff like a corpse, and it was not till he knelt down and bent over her that he perceived her gentle breathing. No sooner had he touched her icy hand, than a painful smile played about her lips, and she lisped, "Is it you, my sweet friend? Have you come to see her once again, who loves you so unspeakably, who dies, alas, because she cannot breathe without you?" Dissolving in sorrow, Peregrine poured himself forth in protestations of the tenderest love, and repeated, that nothing in the world was so dear to him that he would not sacrifice it to her. Out of words grew kisses, but in these kisses again words, like the breathings of love, were distinguishable. "You know, my Peregrine, how much I love you. I can be yours, you, mine. I can recover on the spot, you will see me bloom again in my youthful splendor, like a flower refreshed by the morning dew, and joyfully lifting up his drooping head. But give me up the prisoner, my dear, beloved Peregrine, or else you will see me perish before your eyes, in unutterable death pangs. Peregrine, I can no more, it is all over." With this she sank back upon the cushions, from which she had half raised herself. Her bosom heaved tumultuously up and down, as if, in the death pangs, her lips grew blue, and her eyes seemed to break. In wild anguish Peregrine caught at his neckcloth, from which Master Flea now leapt, of his own accord, upon the white neck of the little one, exclaiming, in a tone of the deepest grief, "I am lost." Peregrine stretched out his hand to catch the master, but suddenly it seemed as if some invisible power held back his arm, and far other thoughts ran through his head than those which till now had occupied it. "How," thought he, "because you are a frail man, and influenced by a mad passion, will you therefore betray him, to whom you have promised your protection? Will you therefore plunge a free, harmless people into eternal slavery, and utterly ruin the friend whose thoughts and words agree? No, no, recollect yourself, Peregrine, rather die than be a traitor. Give her up, the prisoner. I am dying," stammered the little one, with failing voice. "No," cried Peregrine, while in despair he caught her in his arms, "no, never, but let me die with you." And now a fine, penetrating harmony was heard, as if little silver bells were struck. Dörtje, with fresh roses on her lips and cheeks, started up suddenly from the sofa, and, breaking into a convulsive laughter, skipped about the chamber. She seemed to have been bit by the tarantula. Peregrine gazed in terror on the strange spectacle, and the same did the physician, who stood at the door quite petrified, keeping out Mr. Swammer, who had followed him. Sixth adventure. All the passers-by stopped, stretched out their necks, and peeped through the window into the coffee-room. With every moment the crowd grew greater, the pressure more violent, and the noise louder. All this was occasioned by two strangers, who, besides that their form, their dress, their whole manner had something extraordinary about it, that was repulsive and ridiculous at the same time, played off many wonderful tricks, such as had never been seen before. The one, an old man, of a dirty, disagreeable appearance, was dressed in a surtout of shining stuff. Sometimes he made himself thin and long, sometimes he would shrink himself up to a short fat fellow, winding about all the time like a worm. The other, with powdered hair, motley silk coat, underdress of the same, large silver buckles, and altogether resembling a petimater. Of the last half of the foregoing century, repeatedly flew up to the ceiling, and then gently let himself down again, while, with a cheerful voice, he trilled discordant songs in a language altogether unknown. According to the host's declaration, they had both come in, one a short time after the other, like orderly people, and had called for wine. Then they had gazed more and more keenly on each other, and entered into conversation, and although the language of it was unintelligible to all the guests, yet their tone and manner showed they were engaged in a dispute, which grew warmer and warmer. On a sudden they had taken their present form and began these mad tricks, which continually attracted more spectators. "The man who flies up and down so admirably," exclaimed one of the spectators, "is the clockmaker Degen, of Vienna, he who invented the flying machine, with which he is constantly contriving to tumble down upon his nose." "No," replied another, "that is not the clockmaker. I should rather fancy that it was the little tailor of Sachsenhausen, if I did not know that the poor thing was burnt." I know not whether my readers are acquainted with the little tailor of Sachsenhausen. Here it is. History of the little tailor of Sachsenhausen. It happened that a pious little tailor at Sachsenhausen was coming out of church one Sunday with his wife, in all his best attire. The air was raw, the little tailor had taken nothing overnight but a soft boiled egg and a few pickled gherkins, and in the morning a cup of coffee. Moreover, he had been singing most vehemently in the church, and hence he began to feel in a piteous plight, and to long for a dram. As he had worked hard through the week, and had been particularly kind to his better half, making her a very pretty gown out of the pieces cabbaged from his customers, she consented to his going into the apothecary's and getting himself a dram, which he did accordingly. The awkward apprentice, who was alone in the shop, made a mistake, and took down a bottle which, instead of a dram, contained inflammable gas, wherewith balloons are filled. Of this the apprentice poured out a full glass, and the tailor, putting it at once to his mouth, swallowed off the gas as an agreeable reviver. It made him, however, feel very strangely, as if he had got a pair of wings on his shoulders, or as if someone were playing at football with him, for he felt himself compelled to jump up and down in the shop, and with every moment the impetus increased. Gemini! Gemini!" he cried, "what a nimble dancer I have grown." The apothecary's apprentice stood with his mouth gaping wide from pure wonder, when it chanced that someone opened the door so hastily, that the opposite window flew open also. A strong current of air poured in, caught up the little tailor, and away he sailed through the window, since when he has not been seen. But it happened some time after, that the people of Sachsenhausen observed in the air a fireball, which lighted the whole country with its brightness, and then, being extinguished, fell to earth. All were eager to know what had dropped, and ran to the place, but found nothing more than a little heap of ashes, but with this the tongue of a shoe buckle, a little piece of yellow satin with flowers, and something black, which to look at was like the horntop of a walking stick. All were in deep counsel how such things could fall down from heaven in a fireball, when the wife of the departed tailor came up, and, on seeing these things, wrung her hands, took on most piteously, and cried out, "Ah, woe! That is my husband's buckle! Ah, woe! That is my husband's Sunday waistcoat! Ah, woe! That is my husband's cane top!" A very learned man, however, has declared that the cane top was no cane top, but a meteoric ball, or an abortive globe. Thus was made known to the people of Sachsenhausen and to all the world that the poor little tailor, to whom the apothecary's apprentice had given inflammable gas instead of a dram, was burnt in the air, and had fallen to earth, as a meteoric ball, or an abortive globe. The taverner was at length impatient that the odd guest did not cease making himself now larger now smaller, without paying him any attention, and held the flask of Burgundy, which he had ordered, close to his nose. The stranger caught fast hold of it immediately, and did not let go till he had drained the last drop. Then he sank as if fainting into an armchair, and could scarcely move himself. The guests observed with astonishment that he swelled more and more during the drinking, and now appeared quite thick and shapeless. The flywork of the other seemed also to be at a stand. He was about to sit down, panting and breathless, but, perceiving how his adversary lay there, half dead, he flew suddenly upon him, and began to belabor him soundly with his fists. The host, however, pulled him off, and declared that he would turn him out of the house, if he did not keep quiet. If they both wished to show their jugglers' tricks, they were welcome to do so, but without quarreling and fighting like blackguards. The flying gentleman seemed to take it somewhat ill that the host should suppose he was a juggler. He protested that he was nothing less than a vagabond, who went about playing off legerdemain tricks. He had formerly been ballet master to a celebrated king, but now practiced in private as an amateur, and was called, as his functions required he should be, legeny. If, in his just indignation at the abominable fellow there, he had sprung somewhat higher than was fitting, that was his own business, and concerned no one else. The host on his part opined that all this did not justify any fisticuffs, to which the amateur replied that mine host did not know the malicious fellow, or he would willingly allow his back to be drubbed black and blue. He had formerly been a French custom-house officer, and now gained a livelihood by bloodletting, cupping, and shaving, and was called Monsieur Leech, a nuisance to everybody, by his awkwardness, stupidity, and gluttony. It was not enough that the scoundrel, wherever he met him, whisked away the wine from his very lips, as he had done just now, but he was plotting to carry off his bride, whom he intended to carry home from Frankfurt. The douanier had heard all that the amateur advanced, and, glancing at him with his little malicious eyes, said to the host, "Don't believe a syllable that the gallows bird there is chattering. An admirable ballet master, truly, who with his elephant feet crushes the legs of the fair dancers, and with his pirouette knocks a tooth out of the manager's jaw at the wing. And his verses, too, they have as awkward feet as himself, and tumble here and there like drunkards, treading the thoughts to pap. Because he flutters heavily in the air at times, like a drowsy gander, the conceited peacock fancies he is to have the fair one for his bride." At this the indignant amateur cried out, "Thou Satan's worm, thou shalt feel the gander's beak," and would have fallen upon the douanier again, when the host seized him from behind, with strong arm, and, amidst the rejoicing of the assembled crowd, flung him out of the window. No sooner was the amateur gone than Monsieur Leech resumed the plain solid form in which he had entered. The people without took him for quite another person than the juggler, who had played such strange tricks, and quietly dispersed. The douanier thanked mine host in the most obliging terms for his aid against the amateur, and, to prove his gratitude, offered to shave him for nothing, and more pleasantly than ever he had been shaved in his life before. The host felt his beard, and it seeming to him at the moment as if the hairs were terribly long, he accepted Mr. Leech's offer, who accordingly set about it, at first, with a light, dexterous hand, but on a sudden he cut his nose so shrewdly, that the blood streamed down. The host, deeming this to be nothing else than malice, seized the douanier, who flew as nimbly out of the door as the amateur through the window. Immediately after, there arose a loud tumult without, and scarcely allowing himself time to stop the bleeding of his nose with lint, he flew out to see what devil was raising this new uproar. There, to his no little astonishment, he saw a young man, who with one hand grasped the amateur, and with the other the douanier, and with rolling eyes exclaimed, "Ha! Satan's brood! You shall not cross my way, you shall not rob me of Gamaheh," while his prisoners intermixed their cries of, "A madman! Save, save us! Host, he mistakes us, he will murder us." "Aid," cried the host, "what are you about, my good Mr. Pepusch? Have you been offended by these strange people? Perhaps you are mistaken in them. This is the ballet master, Monsieur Legeny, and this the douanier, Monsieur Leech." "Ballet master Legeny, douanier Leech," repeated Pepusch, in a hollow voice. He seemed as if waking out of a dream, and trying to recollect himself. In the meantime 2 honest citizens, of his acquaintance, came out of the inn, who joined in persuading him to be quiet, and let the fellows go about their business. Again Pepusch exclaimed, "Ballet Master Legeny, douanier leech," and let his arms drop powerless by his side. With the speed of wind, the released prisoners were off, and it seemed to many in the street as if the amateur fled over the roofs of the neighboring houses, and the barber was lost in the puddle that had collected itself between the stones before the door. The 2 citizens invited the distracted Pepusch to come in and drink a glass of old hock with them, an offer which he readily accepted, and seemed to enjoy the generous wine, though he sat silent and abstracted, and answered not a word to all that could be said to him. At last, however, his features brightened up, and he said, very kindly, "You did well, my friends, in hindering me from killing on the spot those wretches, who were in my power. But you know not what dangerous creatures lurk beneath their masks." Pepusch paused, and it may be easily supposed with what eagerness the citizens waited for what he had to discover. The host also had approached them, and all 3 poked their heads together, with their arms crossed upon the table, and held in their breath, that they might not lose a syllable from Pepusch's mouth. "See, my good people," he continued solemnly, "see, he whom you call the ballet master, Legeny, is none other than the evil, awkward genius, the tell. The other, whom you take for the douanier, leech, is the hateful bloodsucker, the leech prince. Both are in love with the princess, Gamaheh, who, as you know, is the daughter of the mighty king, Sekakis, and are here to make her false to the thistle, Zeherit. This is the greatest folly that ever entered into a foolish brain, for besides the thistle, Zeherit, there is but one person in the world to whom she can belong, and this person would perhaps vainly enter into the contest with Zeherit. For soon the thistle will bloom at midnight in full splendor and strength, and in the death of love dawns the morning of a higher life. Now, I myself am the thistle, Zeherit, and, therefore, my good friends, you cannot blame me if I am indignant with those traitors, and altogether take the whole affair much to heart." The 3 listeners opened their eyes wide, and stared, speechlessly, at Pepusch, with open mouths. They had tumbled out of the clouds, as people say, and their heads were humming with the fall. But Pepusch emptied a bumper, and, turning to the host, said, "Yes, yes, mine host, you will soon see that I shall bloom as the cactus grandiflorus, and the whole country round will be impregnated with its perfume. You may believe me, friends." The host could utter nothing but an exclamation of stupid surprise. That would be the deuce." The 2 citizens exchanged mysterious glances, and one, taking George's hand, said with a doubtful smile, "You seem to be somewhat disquieted, my good Mr. Pepusch. How, if you were to take a glass of water, and—" "Not a drop," exclaimed Pepusch, interrupting the well-meant counsel, "not a drop. Has water ever been poured upon boiling oil without increasing the fury of the flames? I am disquieted, you say? In truth that may well be the case. How the devil can I be otherwise, after having exchanged shots with my bosom friend, and then sending a bullet through my own brain? Here, into your hands I deliver up the murderous weapons, now that all is over." Pepusch drew a brace of pistols from his pocket, whereat the host started back. The citizens snatched at them, but no sooner had they fairly hold of them, than they burst out into immoderate laughter. The pistols were of wood, a plaything from the Christmas fair. Pepusch seemed to pay no attention to what was going on about him. He sat in deep thought, and continually cried out, "If I could but find him! If I could but find him!" The host took courage, and modestly asked, "Whom do you mean, my good Mr. Pepusch? Whom can you not find?" "Know you," said Pepusch solemnly, and fixing the host with a keen gaze, "know you anyone to be compared, in might and wondrous power, with the king Sekakis? Then name his name and I will kiss your feet. But for the rest, I would ask you if you know anyone who is acquainted with Mr. Peregrinus Tyss, and can tell me where I may meet him at this present moment." To this the host replied, smirking amiably, "Here I can serve you, respected Mr. Pepusch, and inform you that he was with me an hour ago, taking a glass of wine. He was very thoughtful, and when I asked what news on change, he suddenly cried out, "Yes, sweet Gamaheh, I have renounced you. Be happy in my George's arms." Upon this a thin curious voice said, "Let us now go to Luwenhoek's, and peep into the horoscope." Immediately Mr. Tyss emptied his glass, and they went away together, that is, Mr. Tyss and the voice without a body. Probably they have gone to Luwenhoek's, who is lamenting that his well-disciplined fleas have, one and all, deserted him. The words were scarcely out of the host's mouth than George started up in a fury, and, seizing him by the throat, cried out, "Scoundrel, what do you say? Renounced? Renounced her Gamaheh, Peregrine, Sekakis." The host's story, however, was perfectly correct. He had heard Master Flea, who was summoning Peregrine, in his fine silver tones, to go to the microscopist, Luwenhoek, for what purpose the reader knows already. Peregrine had really gone thither, and was received by Luwenhoek with that soft odious friendliness and that humility of compliment which announce the burdensome and reluctant recognition of superiority. But, as Mr. Tyss had the microscopic glass in the pupil of his eye, all this complimenting and subservience availed Antony van Leeuwenhoek nothing in the world. On the contrary, Peregrine only the more discovered the hatred which filled the heart of the microscopist. While he protested how much he felt honored and rejoiced by Mr. Tyss's visit, the thoughts ran thus: "I wish that the devil had plunged you 10,000 fathoms deep in the abyss, but I must feign friendship and submission towards you, as the cursed constellation has placed me under your dominion, and my whole being in some sort depends upon you. But perhaps I may be able to outwit you, for, in spite of your high descent, you are a simple fool. You fancy that Dörtje Elverdink loves you, and will perhaps marry her. Only come to me about it and you fall into my hands, in spite of the power that dwells within you without your knowing it, and I will employ everything to ruin you, and gain possession of Dörtje and Master Flea." Peregrine naturally regulated his conduct by these thoughts, and took good care not to say a syllable about Dörtje Elverdink, and pretended that he came to see Luwenhoek's collection of natural rarities. While now Luwenhoek opened the great drawers, Master Flea whispered very gently in Peregrine's ear that his, Peregrine's, horoscope was lying on the table by the window. Here he saw all manner of lines that mysteriously crossed each other, and many other wonderful signs, but as he was entirely deficient in astronomical knowledge, all remained confused and dark to him, look as keenly as he would. Yet it seemed strange to him that, in the bright red point, in the middle of the table on which the horoscope was drawn, he plainly recognized himself. The longer he looked at this point, the more it gained the shape of a heart, and the more brightly it reddened. Still it only sparkled as through a web, with which it was overspread. Peregrine plainly saw that Luwenhoek wanted to draw off his attention from the horoscope, and as he ran no risk of being deceived, very rationally resolved to question his friendly enemy at once, and without any circumlocution, as to the meaning of the mysterious table. Luwenhoek assured him, with a malicious smile, that nothing would give him greater pleasure than the explaining to his respected friend the signs upon the table, which he himself had drawn, according to his slight knowledge in such matters. The thoughts ran thus: "Ho ho! Are you after that, my wise sir? In truth Master Flea has not advised you ill. I myself am to explain the table, and help you to the understanding of the magic might that dwells in your worthy person. I might invent some lies for you, but of what use would it be? For if I were to tell you the truth, you would not understand a syllable, but would remain stupid as ever. From pure convenience, therefore, and not to put myself to the trouble of invention, I will tell you so much of the signs of the table as seems good to me." Peregrine knew now that if he were not to learn all, at least he would not be deceived with falsehoods. Luwenhoek placed the tablet on something like an easel, which he brought forward from a corner of the room, and both seating themselves before it, considered it for a time in silence. At length Luwenhoek began with much solemnity: "You, perhaps, Do not suspect that those lines, those characters on the table, which you are so attentively considering, are your own horoscope, drawn by myself, with mysterious astrologic art, under the favorable influence of the stars. How came you to such a presumptuous idea? What could make you wish to unravel the web of my fate, to read my destiny? So might you ask, my friend, and with perfect justice, if I were not able to show you my inward call thereto. I know not whether you have heard of the celebrated Rabbi Isaac ben Haravad. Among other profound knowledge, he had the strange gift of reading by men's faces whether the soul had previously inhabited another body, or whether it was to be considered quite fresh and new. I was yet very young when the rabbi died of an indigestion, brought on by eating of a dish highly seasoned with garlic. The Jews ran away with the body so quickly that the deceased had not time to collect and carry off all his knowledge, which the illness had scattered. Laughing heirs divided the property, but I had fished off that wonderful seer gift, in the very moment that the angel of death had set his sword upon the rabbi's breast. In this way the wonderful faculty has come to me, and I, like the Rabbi Isaac ben Haravad, can read in the faces of men, whether the soul has before occupied another body or not. Your brow, Mr. Tyss, when I saw it the first time, excited the strangest thoughts and doubts. I was certain of the previous existence of your soul long ago, and yet the form, prior to your present life, remained a perfect mystery. I was forced to have recourse to the stars, and draw your horoscope, to solve the difficulty. Well, exclaimed Peregrine, and have you discovered anything, Mr. Leeuwenhoek? Certainly, replied Leeuwenhoek, assuming a still more solemn tone, certainly. I have discovered that the physical principle which now animates the agreeable body of my very worthy friend, Mr. Peregrine Tyss, existed long ago, although only as a thought or consciousness of a shape. Look here. Consider attentively the red point in the center of the table. That is not only yourself, but the point is the form, of which your physical principle once could not be conscious. As a sparkling carbuncle, you then lay in a deep mine of the earth, but stretched over you, on the green surface of the ground, slept the beautiful Gamaheh, and her form also passed away in unconsciousness. Strange lines and foreign constellations cross your life from the point of time when the thought first put on a form, and became Mr. Peregrine Tyss. You are in possession of a talisman without knowing it, and this talisman is that very red carbuncle. It may be that King Sekakis wore it as a precious jewel in his crown, or perhaps, in some measure, was the carbuncle itself. Enough, you possess it now, but a certain event must take place if its slumbering power is to be awakened, and with this waking of the power of your talisman will be decided the fate of an unhappy creature, who hitherto has led a shadowy life between fear and changing hope. Alas! It was only a shadowy life that the sweet Gamaheh could gain by the profoundest magic, as the operative talisman was stolen from us. You alone have killed her, you alone can breathe fresh life into her, when the carbuncle glows again in your breast. And can you, interrupted Peregrine, can you explain what that event is which is to awake the power of the talisman? The microscopist stared with open eyes at Peregrine, like a person who is suddenly surprised into confusion, and who does not know what to say. The thoughts ran thus: if I had but held my tongue about the talisman which the unlucky rascal carries within him, and which gives him so much power over us that we must all dance to his pipe. And now I am to tell him the event on which depends the awaking the strength of his talisman. Shall I confess to him that I don't know myself, that all my art fails to loosen the knot in which the lines meet? Nay, that when I consider the planetary center of the horoscope, I feel most piteously, and my own learned head seems to me no better than a painted block for periwigs. Far from me be any such confession that would lower me, and put arms into his hands against myself. I will fasten something upon the idiot who fancies himself so wise, something that shall make his blood run cold, and take from him all farther inclination of teasing me. My dearest sir, said the flea tamer, putting on a very important face, my dearest Mr. Tyss, don't ask me to speak of this event. You know that the horoscope does indeed plainly and perfectly instruct us as to the existence of certain circumstances, but such is the wisdom of eternal might, the event of threatening dangers always remains dark and doubtful. I esteem you too highly as an excellent kind-hearted man to put you into disquiet and anxiety before the time, otherwise I should at least tell you so much, that the event which is to give you the consciousness of power, would in the same moment destroy your present form of being with the most horrible agonies of hell. But no. On that too I will be silent, and now not another word of the horoscope. Do not however fret yourself, although the affair looks bad enough, and I, with all my knowledge, can hardly see any chance of a favorable issue to the adventure. Perhaps you may be saved from this peril by some unexpected constellation which is now beyond the reach of observation. Peregrine was astonished at this deceit, yet still the whole state of the thing, the peculiar situation in which Leeuwenhoek stood without suspecting it, appeared to him so exceedingly pleasant, that he could not help breaking out into a loud fit of laughter. The microscopist, somewhat surprised at this, asked, "What are you laughing at so vehemently, my dear Mr. Tyss?" "You do wisely," replied Peregrine, still laughing, "you do very wisely in keeping secret, out of pure kindness, this threatening event, for besides that you are too much my friend to put me into fear and terror, you have yet another excellent reason for your silence, which is nothing else than that you do not know a syllable about the matter. In vain was all your labor to unriddle that knot, your whole astrology goes but to little, and if Master Flea had not fallen upon your nose, all your arts would have helped you little." Leeuwenhoek's brow was red with rage, he clenched his fist, gnashed his teeth, and trembled so violently with agitation, that he would have tumbled from his seat, if Peregrine had not held him as firmly by the arm as George Pepusch grasped the unlucky taverner by the throat, who at length succeeded in saving himself by a dexterous side-spring. Hereupon George rushed out and entered Leeuwenhoek's room just as Peregrine was holding him fast upon his seat, while he muttered furiously between his teeth, "Cursed Swammerdam, is it you that have done this?" No sooner did Peregrine perceive his friend than he let go of the microscopist, and going up to him, asked anxiously if that strange frenzy were over which had so dangerously possessed him. Pepusch seemed softened almost to tears, and protested that he had not in all his life committed so many follies as in the course of that one day. Amongst these not the least was that after he had sent a ball through his head in the forest, he had gone into a tavern where he did not know had talked to people of strange things, and murderously set upon the host, because from his broken speech he gathered that which was the very happiest thing that could befall him. All his paroxysms would now soon have reached the highest pitch, for the bystanders had taken his words for insanity, and he had to fear, instead of reaping the fruit of the happiest event, that he would be confined in a madhouse. With this he explained what the host had let drop concerning Peregrine's conduct and declarations, and asked, with downcast eyes, whether such an act of self-denial, in favor of an unhappy friend, was probable, or even possible, in the present day, when heroism had vanished from the earth. At these declarations from his companion Peregrine revived in his inmost heart. He protested with warmth that for his part he was far removed from doing anything that might in the least annoy his tried friend, that he solemnly renounced all pretensions to the heart and hand of the fair Dörtje Elverdink, and willingly gave up a paradise, though it had indeed opened upon him most seductively. "And it was you," said Pepusch, rushing into his friend's arms, "it was you that I would have murdered, and because I did not believe you, I therefore shot myself. Oh, the madness of a mind ill at ease." "I pray you," said Peregrine, "I pray you come to your senses. You speak of having shot yourself, and yet stand fresh and sound before me. How do these things agree?" "You are right," replied Pepusch, "it seems as if I could not speak to you so rationally as I really do, if I had actually sent a ball through my brain. The people, too, maintain that my pistols were not particularly dangerous, nor, indeed, of iron, but of wood, in fact mere toys, and so neither the duel nor the suicide could have been anything more than a pleasant mockery. We must have changed our parts, and I have begun to mystify myself and play the child, at the moment you have left the world of dream to enter into real life. But be this as it may, it is requisite that I should be certain of your generosity and my fortune, and then the clouds will dissipate which trouble my sight, or perhaps deceive me with the illusions of the Fata Morgana. Come, my Peregrine, accompany me to the fair Dörtje Elverdink. Pepusch took his friend's arm and was hastening off with him, but their intended walk was spared, for the door opened, and in tripped Dörtje Elverdink, lovely as an angel, and behind her the old swammer. Leeuwenhoek, who had so long remained dumb, casting angry looks first at Pepusch and then at Peregrine, seemed, upon seeing the old swammerdam, as if struck by an electric shock. He stretched his clenched hands towards him, and cried out in a voice hoarse with rage, "Ha! Do you come to mock me, you old deceitful monster? But you shall not succeed. Defend yourself, your last hour has struck." Swammerdam started a few steps back, and as Leeuwenhoek was ready to fall upon him with his telescope, drew the like arms for his defense. The duel, which had begun at Peregrinus, seemed about to be renewed. George Pepusch threw himself between the combatants, and while with his left hand he beat down a murderous glance of Leeuwenhoek's, which would have stretched his adversary to the earth, with the left he turned aside the weapon of Swammerdam, so that he could not injure Leeuwenhoek. He then declared that he would not allow of any battle between them, till he thoroughly knew the cause of their dissension. Peregrine found this protest so reasonable, that he did not hesitate to throw himself between the champions with a similar declaration. To this the combatants were forced to yield. Swammerdam, moreover, asserted that he had not at all come with hostile intentions, but merely to enter into some composition with Leeuwenhoek, and thus to end a feud which had so long divided two similarly created principles, whose united researches only could exhaust the deepest springs of knowledge. With this he looked smilingly at Peregrine, into whose arms Dörtje had fled, and expressed a wish that he would mediate. Leeuwenhoek, on the other hand, admitted that Dörtje was indeed the apple of contention, but that he had just now discovered a new trick of his unworthy colleague. It was not only that to revive his unjust pretensions to Dörtje, he denied the possession of a certain microscope which he had received on a certain occasion as a quittance, but the more to torment him, Leeuwenhoek, he had given it to another. In answer to all this, Swammerdam swore, high and low, that he had never received the microscope, and had great reason to believe that Leeuwenhoek had shamefully purloined it. "The fools," softly whispered Master Flea to Peregrine, "the fools. They are talking of the microscope which is in your eye. You know that I was present at the treaty of peace concluded between them about the possession of the princess, and, when Swammerdam was flinging into the pupil of his left eye the microscopic glass which he had, in fact, received from Leeuwenhoek, I snapped it up, because it was not Leeuwenhoek's, but my lawful property. Tell them plainly at once, that you have the jewel." Upon this Peregrine made no hesitation in declaring that he was in possession of the microscopic glass which Swammerdam should have received, but did not receive, from Leeuwenhoek, and moreover that the union was not yet settled, and neither Leeuwenhoek nor Swammerdam had at present the unconditional right to look on Dörtje Elverdink as his foster daughter. After much argument, it was agreed by the disputants that Mr. Tyss should marry Dörtje Elverdink, who tenderly loved him, and then after 7 months, should decide which of the two microscopists was the most desirable father-in-law. However beautiful Dörtje appeared in a dress so admirable that it might seem to have been fashioned by the Loves, and whatever burning looks of passion she might cast at Peregrine, yet he still thought of his protégé as well as of his friend, and remained true to his plighted word, declaring again that he renounced Dörtje's hand. The microscopists were not a little astonished when Peregrine announced George Pepusch for the man who had the justest claims to the princess, and that he, at all events, had no right to interfere with her choice. With tears in her eyes the maiden staggered towards Peregrine, who caught her in his arms as she was sinking senseless to the earth. "Ingrate," she sighed. "You break my heart in thrusting me from you. But you will have it. Take, then, my parting kiss, and let me die." Peregrine bent down to her, but when his mouth touched her mouth, she bit his lips so violently that the blood started, at the same time exclaiming merrily, "Monster! It is so one must punish you. Be reasonable, be civil, and take me, let the other cry out as he will. During this the two microscopists had fallen together by the ears again, heaven knows wherefore, while George Pepusch flung himself quite disconsolately at Gamaheh's feet, and cried out in a voice that sounded wretched enough for any lover. "Oh, Gamaheh, is then your passion quite extinguished? Do you no more remember the glorious times in Famagusta? No more the pleasant days in Berlin? No more?" "You are a fool," interrupted the little one, laughing, "you are a fool, George, with your Gamahes, your Thistle, Zeherit, and all the other nonsense that you must once have dreamed. I did like you, do like you, and will have you, although the tall one yonder pleases me better, if you solemnly promise, nay swear, to bend all your mind to." Here she softly whispered something to Pepusch, and Peregrine thought he collected that Master Flea was the subject of it. In the meantime the dispute between the microscopists had grown hotter and hotter, they had again recourse to their weapons, and Peregrine was busy in trying to soothe their wrath, when the company was again augmented. The door was burst open amidst a strange screaming and croaking, and in rushed the amateur, Monsieur Legeny, and the barber, Leech. With wild, furious gestures they flew upon the princess, and the barber had already caught her by the shoulder, when Pepusch thrust away the odious assailant with irresistible might, wound about his whole flexible body, and squeezed it together in such a manner that he shot up into the air, quite thin and long, roaring aloud with pain all the time. While this was going on with the barber, the two microscopists had reconciled themselves in an instant on the appearance of the common enemy, and made a united attack on the amateur with much success. It availed him nothing that when he was sufficiently drubbed below, he rose up to the ceiling, for Leeuwenhoek and Swammerdam had both seized short thick sticks, and whenever the amateur descended, they drove him up again by blows, dexterously applied to that part of the body which best can bear them. It was a pretty game of racket, at which the amateur by compulsion indeed played the most fatiguing and at the same time the most ungracious part, namely that of the ball. This war seemed to inspire the little one with the greatest terror. She clung to Peregrine, and entreated him to bear her away from such an abominable uproar. This he could the less refuse, as there seemed to be no need of him on the field of battle, and he therefore carried her home, that is, into the apartments of his lodger. But no sooner had she got there and found herself alone with Peregrine, than she employed all the arts of the most refined coquetry to allure him into her snares. However firmly he bore in mind that all this was merely falsehood, and aimed at bringing his protégé into captivity, yet such a dizziness of the senses seized him, that he did not even think of the microscopic glass, which might have served him as an active antidote. Master Flea was again in danger. He was, however, saved this time by Mr. Swammer, who entered with George Pepusch. The former appeared to be exceedingly delighted, but the latter had wrath and jealousy in his burning glances. Peregrine left the room, and with wounded heart he strolled through the streets of Frankfurt. He went through the gate and onwards, till he reached the very spot where the strange adventure had happened with his friend, Pepusch. Here he again thought over his wonderful destiny. The image of Gamaheh appeared to him lovelier than ever, the blood rolled more quickly in his veins, his pulse beat more violently, and his breast seemed ready to burst with feverish desire. He felt only too painfully the greatness of the sacrifice which he had just made, and with which he fancied that he had lost all the happiness of life. The night had drawn in when he returned to the city. Without being aware of it, perhaps from an unconscious dread of going back to his own house, he wandered through many by-lanes, and at last into the Kalbecher Street. A man with a knapsack on his back asked him if the bookbinder, Lemmerhirt, did not live there, and on looking up, Peregrine saw that he was actually standing before the narrow dwelling. The windows of the industrious binder, who worked through the night, were shining brightly and loftily, and the door was open to the man with a knapsack, who entered immediately. Peregrine now recollected, with vexation, that, in the tumult of the last few weeks, he had forgotten to pay the bookbinder for several jobs that he had executed for him. He resolved to go and settle all the very next morning. 7. Seventh Adventure. Although we are wholly deficient in any certain information respecting the result of the battle in Leeuwenhoek's chamber, yet we cannot suppose otherwise than that the microscopists, with the help of George Pepusch, had obtained a complete victory over the hostile Confederates. It had else been impossible that the old swammer had returned so friendly and contented as he really did. With the same glad face, Swammer, or rather Mr. Jan Swammerdam, came the following morning to Peregrine, who was still in bed and earnestly conversing with his protégé, Master Flea. Upon seeing this visitor, Peregrine did not fail putting the microscopic glass into the pupil of his eye. After many long and tedious excuses for his early visit, Swammerdam at last took his place on the bed, positively refusing to let Peregrine rise and put on his dressing gown. In the strangest phrases he thanked his landlord for the great civilities he had experienced, which, it seems, consisted in his having been received as a lodger, and also in that Mr. Tyss had allowed his household to be increased by the addition of a young female, who was sometimes too loud and vivacious. But the greatest favour shown by Mr. Peregrine, and not without some self-sacrifice, was in his having effected a reconciliation between him, Swammerdam, and his old friend, Antony van Leeuwenhoek. In fact, as Swammerdam went on to say, both hearts had inclined to each other at the moment when they were attacked by the amateur and the barber and had to protect Dörtje Elverdink from those monsters. The serious reconciliation of the microscopists had soon after followed. Leeuwenhoek had perceived, as well as Swammerdam, the paramount influence which Peregrine had over both of them, and the first use which they made of their renewed friendship was to consider in unison the strange horoscope of Mr. Tyss, and as far as possible, to interpret it. What my friend, Leeuwenhoek, could not do alone, continued the microscopist, was effected by our united powers, and thus this was the second experiment which, in spite of all the obstacles opposed to us, we undertook with the most splendid results. The short-sighted fool, lisped Master Flea, who sat upon the pillow, close to Peregrine's ear. He still fancies that the princess, Gamaheh, was restored to life by him. A pretty life, indeed, is that to which the awkwardness of the two microscopists has condemned the poor thing. My dear friend, continued Swammerdam, who had the less heard Master Flea, as he had just then begun to sneeze loudly, my dear friend, you are particularly chosen by the spirit of the creation, a pet child of nature, for you possess the most wonderful talisman, or, to speak more correctly and scientifically, the most splendid Tsilmenager, or Tilsmote, that was ever fed by the dew of heaven, and has sprung from the lap of earth. It is an honor to my art that I, and not Leeuwenhoek, have discovered that this lucky talisman sleeps for a time till a certain constellation enters, which finds its center point in your worthy person. With yourself, my dear friend, something must and will happen, which in the moment the power of the talisman awakes, may make that waking known to you. Let Leeuwenhoek have told you what he will, it must all be false, for in regard to that point, he knew nothing at all until I opened his eyes. Perhaps he tried to frighten you, my dear friend, with some terrible catastrophe, for I know he likes to terrify people without reason. But trust to me, Mr. Tyss, who have the highest respect for you, and swear it to you most solemnly, you have nothing to fear. I should like, however, to learn whether you do not as yet feel the presence of the talisman, and what you think of the matter altogether. At these last words Swammerdam eyed his host as keenly as if he would pierce his deepest thoughts, but of course he did not succeed so well in that as Peregrine with his microscopic glass, by means of which the latter learned that it was not so much the united war with the amateur and the barber, as the mysterious horoscope, that had brought about the reconciliation of the microscopists. It was the possession of the mighty talisman that both were striving after. In regard to the mysterious lines in the horoscope of Peregrine, Swammerdam remained in as vexatious ignorance as Leeuwenhoek, but he fancied the clue must lie within Peregrine, which would lead to the discovery of the mystery. This clue he now sought to fish out of the novice, and then rob him of the inestimable treasure before he knew its value. He was convinced this talisman was equal to that of the wise Solomon, since, like that, it gave him who possessed it the perfect dominion over the kingdom of spirits. Peregrine paid like with like, himself mystifying Swammerdam, who thought to mystify him. He contrived to answer so dexterously, in such figurative speeches, that the microscopist feared the initiation had already begun, and that soon the mystery would be revealed which neither he nor Leeuwenhoek had been able to unravel. Swammerdam cast down his eyes, hemmed, and stammered a few unintelligible words. He was really in a bad plight, and his thoughts were all in confusion. The devil! What's this? Is this Peregrine, who speaks to me? Am I the learned Swammerdam or an ass? In despair he at last collected himself, and began. But to come to something else, most respected Mr. Tyss, and as it seems to me, something much more agreeable. According to what Swammer now went on to say, both he and Leeuwenhoek had perceived, with great pleasure, the strong inclination which Dörtje Elverdink had conceived for him. If they had both formerly been of a different opinion, each believing that Dörtje should stay with himself, and not think of love and marriage, yet they had now both come to a better conviction. They fancied that they read in Peregrine's horoscope he positively must take Dörtje Elverdink for his wife, as the greatest advantage in all the conjunctures of his life, and as neither doubted for a moment that he was equally enamored of her, they had looked upon the matter as fully settled. Swammerdam, moreover, was of opinion that Peregrine was the only one who, without any trouble, could beat his rivals out of the field, and that the most dangerous opponents, namely the amateur and the barber, could avail nothing against him. Peregrine found, from Swammerdam's thoughts, that both the microscopists actually imagined they had read in his horoscope the inevitable necessity of his marriage with Dörtje. It was to this supposed necessity only they yielded, thinking to draw the greatest gain from the apparent loss of the little one, namely, by getting possession of Mr. Tyss and his talisman. But it may be easily supposed how little faith he must have in the science of the two microscopists, when neither of them was able to solve the center point of the horoscope. He did not, therefore, at all yield to that pretended conjunction, which conditioned the necessity of his marriage with Gamaheh, and found no difficulty whatever in declaring positively that he renounced her hand in favor of his best friend George Pepusch, who had older and better claims to the fair one, and that he would not break his word upon any condition. Swammerdam raised his green eyes which he had so long cast down, stared vehemently at Peregrine, and grinned with the cunning of a fox, as he said, if the friendship between him and Pepusch were the only scruple which kept him from giving free scope to his feelings, this obstacle existed no longer. Pepusch had perceived, although slightly touched with madness, his marriage with Dörtje was against the stars, and nothing could come from it but misery and destruction. He had therefore resigned all his pretensions, declaring only that, with his life, he would protect Gamaheh, who could belong to no one but his bosom friend, Tyss, against the awkward dolt of an amateur and the bloodthirsty barber. A cold shudder ran through Peregrine when he perceived, from Swammerdam's thoughts, that all was true which he had spoken. Overpowered by the strangest and the most opposite feelings, he sank back upon his pillow and closed his eyes. The microscopist pressed him to come down himself, and hear from Dörtje's mouth, from George's, the present state of things, and then took his leave with as much ceremony as he had entered. Master Flea, who sat the whole time quietly on the pillow, suddenly leaped up to the top of Peregrine's nightcap. There he raised himself up on his long hind legs, wrung his hands, stretched them imploringly to heaven, and cried out in a voice half stifled with tears. "Woe to poor me! I already thought myself safe, and now comes the most dangerous trial. What avail me the courage, the constancy of my noble patron? I surrender myself. All is over." "Why," said Mr. Tyss, in a faint voice, "why do you lament so on my nightcap, my dear master? Do you fancy that you alone have to complain? That I myself am not in the unhappiest situation in the world? For my whole mind seems broken up, and I neither know what to do, nor which way to turn my thoughts. But do not fancy, my dear master, I am foolish enough to venture near the rock upon which all my resolutions might be shipwrecked. I shall take care not to follow Swammerdam's invitation, and to avoid seeing the alluring Dörtje Elverdink." "In reality," said Master Flea, after he had taken his old post upon the pillow, by Peregrine's ear. In reality, I am not sure that I ought not to advise you to go at once to Swammerdam's, however destructive it may appear to myself. It seems to me as if all the lines of your horoscope were running quicker and quicker together, and you yourself were upon the point of entering the red center. Well, let the dark destiny have decreed what it will. I plainly perceive even a Master Flea cannot escape such a conclusion, and it is as simple as useless to expect my safety from you. Go then, take her hand, deliver me to slavery, and that all may happen as the stars will it, without any interference, make no use of the microscopic glass. Formerly, said Peregrine, formerly, Master Flea, your heart seemed stout, your mind firm, and now you have grown so faint-hearted. You may be as wise as you will, but you have no good idea of human resolution, and at all events, rate it too meanly. Once more, I will not break my word to you, and that you may perceive how fixed my determination is, of not seeing the little one again, I will now rise and betake myself, as I did yesterday, to the bookbinder's. O Peregrine, cried Master Flea, the will of man is a frail thing, a passing air will break it. How immense is the abyss lying between what man wills and what really happens. Many a life is only a constant willing, and many a one, from pure volition, at last does not know what he will. You will not see Dörtje Elverdink, and yet who will answer for it that you do not see her in the very moment of your declaring such a resolution? Strange enough, the very thing really happened which Master Flea had prophesied. Peregrine arose, dressed himself, and faithful to his intention, would have gone to the bookbinder. In passing Swammerdam's chamber, the door was wide open, and he knew not how it happened, he stood, leaning on Swammerdam's arm, close before Dörtje Elverdink, who sent him 100 kisses, and with her silver voice cried out, joyfully, "Good morning, my dear Peregrine." George Pepusch, too, was there, looking out of the window and whistling. He now flung the window to with violence, and turned round. "Ha!" he exclaimed as if he had just then seen Peregrine, "ha! Look! You come to see your bride. That's all in order, and any third person would only be in the way. I too will take myself off, but let me first tell you, my good friend Peregrine, that George Pepusch scorns every gift which a compassionate friend would fling to him as if he were a beggar. Cursed be every sacrifice. I will have nothing to thank you for. Take the beautiful Gamaheh, who so warmly loves you, but take care the thistle, Zeherit, do not take root, and burst the walls of your house." George's voice and manner bordered upon brutality, and Peregrine was filled with vexation, when he saw how much his whole conduct was mistaken. Without concealing his disgust, he said, "It never has entered into my head to cross you in your path, but the madness of jealousy speaks out of you, or you would see how innocent the firstom of all you have been brooding in your own soul. Do not ask of me to kill the snake which you have been nourishing in your breast for your own torment. Learn too, I gave you no alms, I made you no sacrifice, in giving up the fair one, and with her, perhaps, the greatest blessing of my life. Other and higher duties, an irrevocable promise, compelled me to it." Pepusch, in the wildest wrath, raised his clenched hand against his friend, when Gamaheh sprang between them, and catching Peregrine's arm, exclaimed, "Let the foolish thistle go, he has nothing but nonsense in his brain, and as is the way with thistles, is surly and obstinate without well knowing what he means. You are mine, and remain mine, mine own dearest Peregrine." Thus saying, the little one drew Peregrine upon the sofa, and without further ceremony, seated herself upon his knees. Pepusch, after having sufficiently gnawed his nails, ran wildly out of the door. Dressed again in the fairy dress of tissue, she appeared as lovely as ever. Peregrine felt himself streamed through by the electric warmth of her body, and yet, amidst it all, a cold mysterious shudder thrilled through him like the breathing of death. For the first time he thought that he saw something singular and lifeless deeply seated in her eyes, while the tone of her voice, nay, even the rustling of her dress, betrayed a strange being, who was never to be trusted. It fell heavily upon his heart that when she had spoken her real thoughts, she had been in this same silver tissue. He knew not why he should fancy anything menacing in it, and yet the idea of this dress was intimately blended with that of the supernatural, as a dream unites the most heterogeneous things, and all passes for absurd, the deeper connection of which we are unable to comprehend. Far from wounding the fair one with a suspicion which was perhaps false, Peregrine violently suppressed his feelings, and only waited for a favorable opportunity of freeing himself and escaping from the snake of paradise. At last Dörtje said, "How is it, my sweet friend, you seem so cold and insensible today? What have you got in your head, my life?" "I have a headache," replied Peregrine, as indifferently as he was able. "Headache? Whims? Megrims? Nothing else, my sweet child. I must go into the open air, and all will be over in a few minutes. Besides, I am called away by a particular business." "It is all invention," exclaimed Gamaheh, starting up hastily. "But you are a malicious monkey that must be tamed." Peregrine was glad when he found himself in the open street, but as to Master Flea, he was quite extravagant in his joy, tittering and laughing incessantly in Peregrine's neckcloth, and clapping together his forepaws till they rang again. This merriment of his little protégé was somewhat troublesome to Mr. Tyss, as it disturbed him in his meditations, and he begged of him to be quiet, for many grave people had already glanced at him with looks of reproach, fancying it was he who tittered and laughed, and played such foolish pranks in the open streets. "Fool that I was," exclaimed Master Flea, persisting in the ebullitions of his extravagant joy, "fool that I was to doubt of the victory where no battle was needed. Why, you had conquered in the moment, when even the death of your beloved could not shake your resolution. Let me shout, let me rejoice, for all must deceive me if a bright morning sun do not soon arise, which will clear up every mystery." On Peregrine's knocking at the bookbinder's, a soft female voice cried, "Come in." He opened the door, and a young girl, who was alone in the room, came forward, and asked him in a friendly manner what he wanted. She was about 18 years old, rather tall than short, and slim, with the finest proportions. Her hair was of a bright chestnut color, her eyes were of a deep blue, and her skin seemed to be a blended web of lilies and roses. But more than all this were the purity and innocence that sat upon her brow, and showed themselves in all her actions. When Peregrine gazed on the gentle beauty, it seemed to him as if he had been hitherto lying in bonds, which a benevolent power had loosened, and the angel of light stood before him. But his enamored gaze had confounded the maiden. She blushed deeply, and casting down her eyes, repeated more gently than at first, "What does the gentleman want?" With difficulty Peregrine stammered out, "Pray, does the bookbinder Gamaheh live here?" Upon her replying that he did, but that he was now gone out upon business, Peregrine talked confusedly of bindings which he had ordered, of books which Gamaheh was to procure for him, till at last he came somewhat more to himself, and spoke of a splendid copy of Ariosto, which was to have been bound in red morocco with golden filleting. At this, it was as if a sudden electric spark had shot through the maiden. She clasped her hands, and with tears in her eyes, exclaimed, "Then you are Mr. Tyss." At the same time she made a motion as if she would have seized his hand, but suddenly drew back, and a deep sigh seemed to relieve her full breast. The sweet smile beamed on her face, like the lovely glow of morning, and she poured forth thanks and blessings to Peregrine for his having been the benefactor of her father and mother, and not only for this, no, for his generosity, his kindness, the manner of his making presents to the children, and spreading joy and happiness amongst them. She quickly cleared her father's armchair of the books, bound and unbound, with which it was loaded, wheeled it forward, and pressed him to be seated, and then presented to him the splendid Ariosto with sparkling eyes, well knowing that this masterpiece of bookbinding would meet with Peregrine's approbation. Mr. Tyss took a few pieces of gold from his pocket, which, the maiden seeing, hastily assured him that she did not know the price of the work, and therefore could not take any payment. Perhaps he would be pleased to wait a few minutes for her father's return. It seemed to Peregrine as if the unworthy metal melted into one lump in his hand, and he pocketed the gold again, much faster than he had brought it out. Upon his seating himself mechanically in the broad armchair, The maiden reached after her own seat, and from instinctive politeness he jumped up to fetch it, when, instead of the chair, he caught hold of her hand, and on gently pressing the treasure, he thought he felt a scarcely perceptible return. "Puss, Puss, what are you doing?" suddenly cried Rose, breaking from him, and picking up a skein of thread, which the cat held between her forepaws, beginning a most mystical web. Peregrine was in a perfect tumult, and the words "Oh, princess" escaped him without his knowing how it happened. The maiden looked at him in alarm, and he cried out in the softest and most melancholy tone, "My dearest young lady." Rose blushed, and said with maiden bashfulness, "My parents call me Rose. Pray, do the same, my dear Mr. Tyss, for I too am one of the children, to whom you have shown so much kindness, and by whom you are so highly honored." "Rose," cried Peregrine, in a transport. He could have thrown himself at her feet, and it was only with difficulty that he restrained himself. Rose now related, as she quietly went on with her work, how the war had reduced her parents to distress, and how since that time she had lived with an aunt in a neighboring village, till a few weeks ago, when, upon the death of the old lady, she had returned home. Peregrine heard only the sweet voice of Rose, without understanding the words too well, and was not perfectly convinced of his being awake, till Gamaheh entered the room and gave him a hearty welcome. Soon after the wife followed with the children, and as thoughts and feelings are strangely blended in the mind of man, it happened now that Peregrine, even in the midst of all his ecstasy, suddenly recollected how the sullen Pepusch had blamed his presence to this very family. He was particularly delighted to find that none of the children had made themselves ill by his gifts, and the pride with which they pointed to a glass case, where the toys were shining, proved that they looked upon them as something extraordinary, never perhaps to recur. The thistle, in his ill humor, was quite mistaken. "Oh, Pepusch," said Peregrine to himself, "no pure beam of love penetrates thy distempered mind." In this Peregrine again meant something more than toys and sugar plums. Gamaheh approached Peregrine and began to talk in an undertone of his Rose, elevating her, in the fullness of his heart, into a perfect miracle. But what gave him the most delight was that Rose had an inclination for the noble art of bookbinding, and in the few weeks that she had been with him had made uncommon advances in the decorative parts, so that she was already much more dexterous than many an oaf of an apprentice who wasted gold and morocco for years, and set the letters all awry, making them look like so many drunken peasants, staggering out of an alehouse. In the exuberance of his delight, he whispered to Peregrine quite confidentially, "It must out, Mr. Tyss, I can't help it. Do you know that it was my Rose who gilded the Ariosto?" Upon hearing this, Peregrine hastily snatched up the book, as if securing it before he was robbed of it by an enemy. Gamaheh took this for a sign that Peregrine wished to go, and begged of him to stay a few minutes longer, and this it was that reminded him at last of the necessity of tearing himself away. He hastily paid his bill and set off home, dragging along the heavy quartos as if they had been some treasure. On entering his house he was met by the old Alina, who pointed to Swammerdam's chamber with looks of fear and anxiety. The door was open, and he saw Dörtje Elverdink, sitting in an armchair, quite stiff, with a face drawn up, as if it belonged to a corpse, already laid in the grave. Just so stiff, so corpse-like sat before her Pepusch, Swammerdam, and Leeuwenhoek. The old woman exclaimed, "Is not that a strange, ghastly spectacle? In this manner the three unhappy beings have sat the whole day long, and eat nothing, and drink nothing, and speak nothing, and scarcely fetch their breath." Peregrine at first felt a slight degree of terror at this strange spectacle, but as he ascended the stairs, the spectral image was completely swallowed up by the sea of pleasure, in which the delighted Peregrine swam, since his seeing Rose. Wishes, dreams, hopes, were agitating his mind, which he longed to unburden to some friend, but what friend had Peregrine besides the honest Master Flea? And to him he wished to open his whole heart, to tell him all about Rose, all in fact that cannot very well be told. But he might call and coax as long as he pleased, no Master Flea would show himself. He was up and away, at last, in the folds of his neckcloth, where Master Flea had been wont to lodge upon his going abroad. Peregrine found, after a more careful search, a tiny box, whereon was written, "In this is the microscopic glass. If you look steadfastly into the box with your left eye, the glass will immediately be in its pupil. When you want to be freed from the instrument, you have only to gently squeeze the pupil, holding your eye over the box, and the glass will drop into it. I am busy in your service, and risk no little by it, but for so kind a protector I would hazard anything, as your most devoted servant, Master Flea." Now here would be an excellent opportunity for a genuine romance writer to expatiate on the difference between lust and love, and having handled it sufficiently in theory, to illustrate it practically in the person of Mr. Tyss. Much might be said of sensual desires, of the curse of the primal sin, and of the heavenly Promethean spark, which in love inflames that true community of spirit of the two sexes, which forms the actual necessary dualism of nature. Should now the aforesaid Promethean spark, but the reader will perhaps be glad to escape the rest of this dissertation, though he may rest assured there is much in it whereby he might have been edified, had he been so inclined. It must be evident to all that Peregrine only felt desire for Dörtje Elverdink, but that when he saw Rose Lemmerhirt, the real heavenly love blazed in his bosom. Little thanks, however, would be due to the editor of this most wonderful of all wonderful tales, if, adhering to the stiff, formal pace of renowned romancers, he could not forbear in this place exciting the weariness essentially requisite to a legitimate romance. No, let us go to the point at once. Sighs, lamentations, joys, pains, kisses, blisses, are all united in the focus of the moment, when the lovely Rose, with the crimson of maiden modesty upon her cheeks, confesses to the enraptured Peregrine that she loves him, that she cannot express how much, how immeasurably she loves him, that she lives in him only, that he is her only thought, her only joy. But the crafty demon is wont to thrust his dark claws into the sunniest moments of life, nay, to utterly obscure that sunshine by the shadow of his baleful presence. Thus it happened that evil doubts arose in Peregrine, and his breast was filled with suspicions. A voice seemed to whisper to him, how Dörtje Elverdink confessed her love, and yet it was mere selfishness, animated by which she sought to tempt you into breaking your faith and becoming a traitor to your best friend, poor Master Flea. You are rich. They say too that a certain frankness and good nature, by many called weakness, may procure you the doubtful love of men and even of women, and she, who now confesses a passion for you. He hastily snatched at the fate-fraught box, and was on the point of opening it to place the microscopic glass in the pupil of his eye, and thus reading the thoughts of Rose, but he looked up, and the pure blue of her bright eyes seemed to be reflected on his inmost soul. Rose saw and wondered at his emotion. He felt as if a sudden flash of lightning had quivered through him, and the feeling of his own unworthiness overwhelmed him. How, said he to himself, would you with sinful presumption penetrate into the sanctuary of this angel? Would you read thoughts, which have nothing in common with the wretched actions of minds entangled in earthly considerations? Would you mock the spirit of love himself, and try him with the accursed arts of dangerous and supernatural powers? He hastily put up the box, with a feeling as if he had committed some sin that could never be atoned, and dissolved in sadness, flung himself at the feet of the terrified Rose, exclaiming that he was a wretched sinner, unworthy of the love of so innocent, so pure a being. Rose, who could not conceive what dark spirit had come over Peregrine, sank down to him, embraced him, and murmured with tears, "For God's sake, my dear Peregrine, what is the matter with you? What evil enemy has placed himself between us? Oh, come, come, and sit down quietly by me." Incapable of any voluntary motion, Peregrine suffered himself to be raised by Rose in silence. It was well that the frail old sofa was loaded, as usual, with books and the tools for binding, so that Rose had many things to clear away to make room for Mr. Tyss. By this he gained time to recover himself, and his first wild passion subsided into a milder feeling. But if before he had looked like a most disconsolate sinner, upon whom a sentence of condemnation had been irrevocably pronounced, he now wore a somewhat silly appearance. This, however, in such circumstances, is a favorable prognostic. When now both were seated on the aforesaid frail sofa, Rose began, with downcast eyes, and a half-bashful smile, "I can guess what has affected you so, dear Peregrine, and will own that they have told me many strange things of the singular inhabitants of your house. The neighbours, you know what neighbours are, how they talk and talk, without knowing why or wherefore. These evil-minded neighbours have told me of a strange lady in your house, whom many take for a princess, and whom you brought home yourself on Christmas Eve. They say that the old Mr. Swammer has indeed received her as his niece, but that she pursues you with strange arts and temptations. This, however, is by no means the worst. Only think, my dear Peregrine, my old cousin just opposite with the sharp nose, who sends over such friendly greetings when she sees you here, she has tried to put all manner of bad things into my head about you. Notwithstanding her friendly greetings, she has always warned me against you, and maintained that nothing less than sorcery was carried on in your house, and that the little Dörtje is an imp in disguise, who, to seduce you, goes about in a human form, and, indeed, in a very beautiful one. But, Peregrine, my dear Peregrine, look at me. Is there anything like doubt upon my face? I trust you, I trust the hopes of happiness to come upon us, when a firm band has united us forever. Let the dark spirits have determined what they will in regard to you, their power is fruitless against pure love and unchanging constancy. What can disturb a love like ours? It is the talisman, before which the nightly images all fly. At this moment Rose appeared to Peregrine like a higher being, and each of her words like the consolations of heaven. An indescribable feeling of the purest delight streamed through him, like the sweet mild breath of spring. He was no longer the sinner, the impious presumer, which he had before held himself. He began to think with joy that he was worthy of the love of the innocent Rose. The bookbinder, Gamaheh, now returned with his family from a walk. The hearts of Rose and Peregrine were overflowing, and it was not till late that he quitted, as an accepted bridegroom, the narrow abode of the bookbinder, whose joy exalted him to heaven, while the old woman, from pure delight, sobbed rather more than was necessary. The authentic records, from which this wonderful history has been taken, agree in one point, and the Chronicle of Centuries confirms it, that in the night when Mr. Peregrine Tyss returned home as a happy lover, the full moon shone very brightly. It seems therefore natural enough, that, instead of going to rest, he seated himself at the open window, to stare at the moon, and think of his beloved, according to the usual custom of gentlemen, more particularly if they happen to be somewhat romantic. When under the influence of the tender passion. But, however it may lower Mr. Peregrine Tyss with the ladies, it must not be concealed that, in spite of all his enthusiasm, he gaped twice, and so loudly, that a drunkard in the streets below called out to him, "Holla! You there with the white nightcap, don't swallow me." This of course was a sufficient cause for his dashing down the window so violently, that the frame rattled again. It is even affirmed that, in so doing, he cried out loud enough, "Impudent scoundrel." But this cannot be relied upon, as it by no means accords with his general suavity of disposition. Enough, he shut the window, and went to bed. The necessity for sleep, however, seemed to be superseded by that immoderate gaping. Thoughts upon thoughts crossed his brain, and with peculiar vividness came before his eyes the surmounted danger, when a darker power would have tempted him to the use of the microscopic glass, and now it became plain to him that Master Flea's mysterious present, however well intended, was yet in all respects a gift from hell. How, said Peregrine to himself, for a man to read the most hidden thoughts of his brothers, does not this fateful gift bring upon him the dreadful destiny of the wandering Jew, who wandered through the motliest crowds of life, as through a desert, without joy, without hope, without pain, in dull indifference, which is the caput mortuum. of despair. Always trusting anew and always most bitterly deceived, how can it be otherwise than that distrust, hatred, jealousy, vindictiveness would nestle firmly in the soul, destroying every trace of that human principle, which shows itself in benevolence and gentle confidence? No, your friendly face, your smooth words, shall not deceive me, you, who in your inmost heart are concealing perhaps unmerited hate against me. I will hold you for my friend, I will do you as much good as I can, I will open my soul to you, because it gratifies me, and the bitter feeling of the moment, if you should deceive me, is little in comparison with the joys of a past dream. Even to the real friends, who truly mean you well, how changeable is the mind of man. May not an evil coincidence of circumstances, a misinclination growing out of the whims of chance, create transitory hatred in the bosom of the dearest friends? The unlucky glass shows the thoughts, distrust immediately occupies the mind, and in unjust wrath I push from me the real friend, and this poison goes on, eating deeper and deeper into the roots of life, till I am at variance with everything, even with myself. No, it is rank impiety to wish for an equality with the eternal power, who sees through the heart of man, because he is its master. Away, away with the unlucky gift. He caught up the little box, which held the magic glass, and was on the point of dashing it against the floor with all his might, when suddenly Master Flea stood before him on the counterpane. He was in his microscopic form, and looked extremely graceful and handsome, in a glittering scale breastplate, and highly polished golden boots. "Hold," he cried, "hold, most respected friend, do not commit an absurdity. You would sooner annihilate a sun mote than fling this little indestructible glass but a foot from you, while I am near. For the rest, though you are not aware of it, I was sitting, as usual, in the folds of your neckcloth, when you were at the honest bookbinder's, and therefore heard and saw all that passed. Just so I have been a party to your present edifying soliloquy, and have learned several things from it. In the first place, you have shown the purity of your mind in all its glory, whence I infer that the decisive moment is fast approaching. Then too I have found that in regard to the microscopic glass, I was in a great error. Believe me, my honored friend, although I have not the pleasure to be a man, as you are, but only a flea, no simple one, indeed, but a graduate, still I thoroughly understand human beings, amongst whom I so constantly live. Most frequently their actions appear to me very ridiculous, and even childish. Do not take it ill, my friend, I speak it only as Master Flea. You are right. It would be a bad thing, and could not possibly lead to any good, if a man were able to spy thus, without ceremony, into the brains of his neighbors. Still to the careless, lively flea this quality of the microscopic glass is not in the least dangerous. Most honored friend, and as fortune soon will have it, most happy friend, you know that my people are of a reckless, merry disposition, and one might say that they consisted of mere youthful springalds. With this I can, for my part, boast of a peculiar sort of wisdom, which in general is wanting to you children of men, that is, I never do anything out of season. To bite is the principal business of my life, but I always bite in the right time and right place. Lay that to your heart, my worthy friend. I will now back from your hands, and faithfully preserve the gift, intended for you, and which neither that preparation of a man, called Swammerdam, nor Leeuwenhoek, who wears himself out with petty envy, could possess. And now, my honored Mr. Tyss, resign yourself to slumber. You will soon fall into a dreamy delirium, in which the great moment will reveal itself. At the right time I shall be with you again. Master Flea disappeared, and the brilliance, which he had spread, faded away in the darkness of the chamber, the curtains of which were closely drawn. It fell out as Master Flea had said. Peregrine fancied that he was lying on the banks of a murmuring wood stream, and heard the sighing of the wind, the whispering of the leaves, and the humming of 1,000 insects that buzzed about him. Then it seemed as if strange voices were audible, plainer and still plainer, so that at last Peregrine thought he could make out words. But it was only a confused and stunning hubbub that reached his ear. At length these words were pronounced by a solemn, hollow voice that sounded clearer and clearer. Unhappy king, Sekakis, thou who didst despise the intelligence of nature, who, blinded by the evil spells of a crafty demon, didst look upon the false teraphim, instead of the real spirit. In that fate-fraught spot at Famagusta, buried in the deep mine of the earth, lay the talisman, but, when you destroyed yourself, there was no principle to rekindle its frozen powers. In vain you sacrificed your daughter, the beautiful Gamaheh, in vain was the amorous despair of the thistle, Zeherit, but at the same time impotent and inoperative was the bloodthirst of the leech prince. Even the awkward genius, the tell, was obliged to let go his sweet prey, for so mighty still, O king, Sekakis, was thy half-extinct idea, that thou couldst return the lost one to the primal element, from which she sprang. And ye, insane anatomists of nature, that ever the unhappy one should have fallen into your hands, when you discovered her in the petal of a tulip, that you should have tormented her with your detestable experiments, presuming, in your childish arrogance, that you could effect that by your wretched arts, which could only happen by the power of that sleeping talisman. And you, Master Flea, even to you it was not granted to pierce the mystery, for thy clear sight had not yet the power to penetrate the depths of earth, and see the frozen carbuncle. The stars now crossed each other in strange motions, and fearful constellations produced the wonderful, the inscrutable to the purblind sight of man. But still no starry conflict awoke the carbuncle, for the human mind was not born that could cherish it, but at last. The wonder is fulfilled, the moment is come. A bright shine flickered by Peregrine, he awoke out of his stupefaction, and to his no little surprise, perceived Master Flea, who, in his microscopic form, but clad in a splendid drapery, and holding a blazing torch in his forepaws, busily skipped up and down the chamber, and trilled forth the finest tones imaginable. Peregrine strove to rouse himself from sleep, when suddenly 1,000 fiery flashes quivered through the room, that in a short time seemed to be filled by one single glowing ball of fire. Then a mild aromatic breeze waved through the wild blaze, which soon died away into the softest moonlight. Peregrine now found himself on a splendid throne in the rich garments of an Indian king, the sparkling diadem upon his head, the emblematic lotus flower in his hand instead of a scepter. The throne stood in the midst of a hall so large the eye could not take in its extent, and its 1,000 columns were slim cedars, aspiring to the heavens. Between them, roses and the most odorous flowers of every kind lifted up their heads from amidst a dark foliage, as if longing for the pure bright azure that glittered through the twined branches of the cedars, and seemed to look down upon them with the eyes of love. Peregrine recognized himself. He felt that the carbuncle, rekindled into life, was glowing in his own breast. In the farthest background the genius, the tell, was laboring to rise into the air, but never was able to reach half the height of the cedars, and fell back again to earth. Here the odious leech prince was crawling with abominable contortions, now blowing himself out, and then again extending himself, and groaning out, all the time, Gamaheh, still mine. In the middle of the hall, upon colossal microscopes, sat Luwenhoek and Swammerdam, making most piteous faces, and reproachfully calling out to each other, "See now. That was the point in the horoscope, the meaning of which you could not interpret. The talisman is lost to us forever." Close upon the steps of the throne Dörtje Elverdink and George Pepusch seemed not so much to sleep as to be in a deep swoon. Peregrine, or, as we may now call him, King Sekakis, flung back the regal mantle that covered his breast, and from within, the carbuncle shot forth dazzling beams, like heaven's fire, through the immense hall. The genius the tell again tried to rise, but he fell away with a hollow groan into innumerable colourless flocks, which, driven by the wind, were lost in the bushes. With the most horrible cries of agony, the leech prince shrunk up, and vanished into the earth, while an indignant roar was heard, as if she reluctantly received into her bosom the odious fugitive. Luwenhoek and Swammerdam had sunk down from the microscopes into themselves, and it was plain, from their sighs and groans, that they were undergoing a severe punishment. But Dörtje Elverdink and George Pepusch, or, as we should now call them, Princess Gamaheh and the Thistle, Zeherit, had awakened from their swoon, and knelt before the king. Their eyes were cast to earth, as if unable to bear the burning splendor of the carbuncle. Peregrine addressed them all with solemnity. Thou, who shouldst deceive men as the genius, the tell, thou wert compounded by the evil demon of clay and feathers, and therefore the beaming of love destroyed thee, empty phantom, and thou wert reduced to thy original nothing. And thou too, bloodthirsty monster of the night, thou wast forced to fly from the fire of the carbuncle into the bosom of the earth. But you, poor dupes, unhappy Swammerdam, wretched Leeuwenhoek, your whole life was one incessant error. You sought to inquire into nature, without suspecting the import of her inward being. You were presumptuous enough to wish to penetrate into her workshop and watch her secret labors, imagining that you could, without punishment, look into the fearful mysteries of those depths, which are inscrutable to the human eye. Your hearts remained cold and insensible, the real love has never warmed your bosom. You imagined that you read the holy wonders of nature with pious admiration, but in endeavoring to find out the condition of those wonders, even in their inmost core, yourself destroyed that pious feeling, and the knowledge after which you strove was a phantom merely, that has deceived you, like prying, inquisitive children. Fools! For you the beams of the carbuncle no longer have hope or consolation. Ha! Ha! There is hope, there is consolation, the old one betakes herself to the old ones, there's love, there's truth, there's tenderness, and the old one is now really a queen, and takes her little Swammerdam and her little Leeuwenhoek into her kingdom, and there they are princes, and wind gold thread and silver thread, and do many other useful things. So spoke the old Alina, who suddenly stood between the two microscopists, clad in a strange dress, which nearly resembled the costume of the Queen of Golconda in the opera. But Leeuwenhoek and Swammerdam had so shrunk up, that they seemed to be scarcely a span high, and the Queen of Golconda, putting her puppets into 2 ivory cradles, rocked and nursed them, and sang to them lullaby, lullaby, baby mine, etc. During this the Princess Gamaheh and the Thistle, Zeherit, were still kneeling on the steps of the throne. Peregrine spoke. Yes, beloved pair, the error is past, which disturbed your lives. Come, dear ones, to my breast. The beam of the carbuncle will penetrate your hearts, and you will enjoy the blessedness of heaven. With a cry of joy and hope, the lovers started up, and Peregrine pressed them strongly to his glowing heart. When he released them, they fell, transported, into each other's arms, the corpse-like paleness had vanished from their brows, and the freshness of youth bloomed on their cheeks and sparkled in their eyes. Master Flea, who had hitherto stood by the throne with all the gravity of a guard of honor, suddenly resumed his natural shape, and with a vigorous spring he leaped upon Dörtje's neck, crying out, in a shrill voice, "Old love never changes." But, oh wonder! In the same moment, Rose lay upon Peregrine's breast, in all her youthful beauty, beaming with the purest love, like a cherub from heaven. And now the branches of the cedars rustled, the flowers lifted their heads more loftily, soft melodies poured from the bushes, and the thousand voices of delight rose from earth, and air, and water. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Mr. Peregrine Tyss had purchased a handsome villa in the vicinity of the city, and here on the same day was to be celebrated the double marriage of himself with Rose, and his friend George Pepusch with the little Dörtje Elverdink. The kind reader will excuse my entering into the details of the nuptial feast and ceremonies. For my part, one am willing to leave it to my fair readers to settle the dress of the 2 brides according to their own fancy. It is only to be observed that Peregrine and his beautiful Rose were all simple delight, while George and Dörtje, on the contrary, were meditative, and with mutual gaze seemed to have thoughts, eyes, and ears for each other only. Asterisk 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 asterisk. It was midnight, when suddenly the balsamic odors of the large-blossomed thistle spread through the whole garden. Peregrine awoke from sleep. He fancied that he heard the plaintive melody of hopeless desire, and a strange foreboding got possession of him. It seemed to him as if a friend were violently torn from him. The next morning the second bridal pair was missing, namely, George Pepusch and Dörtje Elverdink. What added not a little to the general astonishment was that they had not at all entered the bridal chamber. In this moment of doubt, the gardener came and exclaimed, he did not know what to think of it, but a strange wonder had happened in the garden. Throughout the whole night he had dreamt of the blooming cactus grandiflorus, and not till now discovered the cause of it. They should only come and see. Peregrine and Rose went into the garden. In the middle of a clump of flowers a lofty thistle had shot up, which drooped its withering blossom beneath the morning sun. About this a variegated tulip wound itself, and that also had died a vegetable death. "Oh, my foreboding," cried Peregrine, while his voice trembled with sadness. "Oh, my foreboding! It has not deceived me. The beams of the carbuncle, which have kindled me to the highest life, have given death to thee, thou sweet pair, united by the strange discords of opposing powers. The mystery is revealed, the highest moment of gratified desire was also the moment of thy death." Rose too seemed to have a foreboding of the wonder. She bent over the poor perished tulip, and shed a stream of tears. "You are quite right," said Master Flea, who suddenly appeared in his microscopic form on the top of the thistle. "You are quite right, my dear Mr. Peregrine. It is all as you have said, and I have lost my beloved forever." Rose was at first somewhat frightened at the little creature, but seeing that he gazed on her with such friendly, intelligent eyes, and Peregrine spoke so familiarly with him, she took heart, looked boldly on his graceful tiny form, and gained so much the more confidence in him as Peregrine whispered to her, "This is my kind Master Flea." "My good Peregrine," said Master Flea very tenderly, "my dear lady, I must now leave you, and return to my people, yet I shall always be your devoted friend, and you shall constantly experience my presence in a way that will be agreeable to you. Farewell. Heartily farewell to both of you. And all good fortune be with you." During this he had resumed his natural form, and vanished without leaving a single trace behind. Here the records suddenly break off, and the wonderful history of Master Flea comes to a joyous and wished-for end. The end.